Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Casual Criminalist. Settle in for a long one. This is the Snowtown murders. Insanity, torture, and bodies in barrels. We're in for a grim, very, very long 54-page journey today. Thank you, David, who wrote today's script. The format of the show, if you're new here, I read it, never read it before. Let's jump in. I think we found the bodies. These were the first words uttered by Detective Senior Constable Steve McCoy to a mustering platoon of investigators from the State Police Major Crimes Branch, the local Snowtown Constabulary, and the Crime Scene Investigation Squad. It was 1 p.m. on May the 20th, 1999, in the sleepy town of Snowtown, with a population of just 400 people, 145 kilometers north of the city of Adelaide in South Australia. We're down under today, are we? David is down under. David lives in, well, I don't want to tell you exactly where David lives. It's a bad idea. Don't dox David. But he lives in Australia. I suppose I could say, say the town, but now I can't remember its name. I'm sorry. Never mind. Pointless aside. Minutes later, at precisely 1:12 p.m, law enforcement arrived at 30 Railway Terrace in East Snowtown. The address was the site of a small, derelict bank that had closed down 4 years earlier in 1995. It was a shabby red brick building with white paint peeling off the rotten wood pillars, which held up a crude, corrugated steel awning that had once shielded the bank's customers from the harsh Australian sun. The front entrance of the bank itself was covered by a rusting steel shutter, which hadn't been lifted since the day the bank closed down. The only functional entrance to the bank was around the left-hand side of the building, past an equally dilapidated fence that opened from the street. The old bank was in many ways symbolic of a wilting, shrinking town. A town of 400 people has its own bank? 400 people is not that many people. Just like the hundreds of towns across Australia that had gone into remission in the latter half of the 20th century as people flocked to the country's 5 major cities that now contained roughly 65% of Australia's total population. For the record, Snowtown was named after the Snow family, a prominent clan of people who lived in the area in the late 19th century. There is no snow in Snowtown. It is a warm Mediterranean climate that, even in the depths of winter, rarely dips below 16 degrees Celsius or 60 Fahrenheit. That sounds nice. Like, Australia does sound like the weather sounds so nice in Australia. Like Europe, the weather is so cold in the winter, whereas Australia, it's like, yeah, winter is 16 degrees. I'm like, god damn, winter here is like minus 16 degrees. Just before we dive in today, got a huge shout out to our sponsor, Conflict of Nations. Have you ever wanted to lead your own country to victory in modern global warfare? Well, probably not in real life, but that's where Conflict of Nations comes in. A free online PvP strategy game where you're not just playing, you are dominating. Conflict of Nations lets you choose a real country, build your army, and engage in battles that can last 4 weeks. Tanks, jets, nuclear submarines, you name it, you command it. And the best part, you can declare war on your neighbors or form alliances with other players. It's like a global chess game, but with way cooler pieces. You've got complete freedom to shape your own strategy. Whether you're into long-term planning, PvP showdowns, or real-time action, Conflict of Nations has got you covered. And you can seamlessly switch between PC and mobile. Click on the link below to get 13,000 gold and a free 1-month premium subscription. It's only available for the next 30 days, so don't miss out. And now, let's get into today's video. After all, Australia is the land of sun, surf, and horrendous poisonous shit. The land I love, God bless her. The old bank at 30 Railway Terrace had recently been leased to a man named Mark Lawrence, who used the building for storage. Lawrence was a puppet. He wasn't from Snowtown, and the man controlling him could easily have chosen a building in any number of the surrounding communities to store his stuff. But it was Snowtown that he selected for the task, and in doing so, it was the name of Snowtown that would bear an enduring stain of notoriety. The locals still curse the fact that they were randomly chosen by Mark Lawrence and his master to this day. I was confused there for a second because I'm like, wait, Mark Lawrence is a puppet? In what sense? So whose bidding is Mark Lawrence doing? People are doing crimes together, and that's already breaking the rules. Don't do crimes with other people. It just increases the chances that you're going to get snitched on. Using a key given to them by Lawrence's friend, Dennis Caldwell, local detective Rick Day opens the side door to the bank. CSI Constable Gordon Drake was the first inside. Despite his senses immediately being bludgeoned by a sickly sweet odor, Drake walked through the staff kitchen area to the front part of the bank. The lobby and teller's counter had been filled with boxes full of old electronics, televisions, computers and the like. An air freshener was plugged into a power socket in the corner of the room. Doubtless this was in a feeble attempt to cover up the putrid stench that filled the building's interior. Bruh, I'm assuming that there's like bodies in there. Is that what you do? Oh yeah, well we plugged a Glade air freshener in so no one will know. And it's like when you do a horribly stinky shit and then you give it like a little squirt of air freshener and you're like, no, it just smells of shit and air freshener, which is somehow worse. Because it's like, it's just covering it up. Like, I don't understand when people, like, when there's a bad smell, people are like, just breathe through your mouth. And I'm like, at least when it's going through my nose, I feel like it's getting filtered a little bit. And I know I have to smell it, but it's like, through the mouth, it's like, you can almost taste that fart. Grim. Not as grim as these bodies, but still grim. When CSI officer Bronwyn Marsh followed Drake into the building, she immediately began to dry heave and had to retreat back outside. All the officers present knew what that smell was: rotting flesh. Gordon Drake walked back to the bank and took note of a vault door with flaking white paint that had long since been stained yellow. It had an old-fashioned dial combination lock. Drake dusted the door for fingerprints. He found one in the vault door's top left-hand corner. Then Drake went back outside and declared that they'd need to figure out how to break into the vault. Dennis Caldwell replied, "No worries, mate." The combination lock didn't work anymore, and they had simply been picking the lock open with a piece of wire. Caldwell retrieved an old strip of fencing wire and used some pliers to bend it at one end. Drake took the wire, inserted the bent end into the lock, and after several minutes of jiggling it, he felt the locking mechanism move. Wait, that's how easily he breaks into a bank's vault? This guy needs to be like a master criminal, holy shit. He's just like, I'll just use this piece of fence and I'll break into a bank's vault. It was now 2:24 p.m. The cops were ready to confront the source of the stench. Adelaide detective Greg Stone strapped on some plastic gloves, approached the vault, grabbed the heavy handle, and opened the door. The entrance to the vault had been covered with a black plastic sheet, split down the middle and taped up again. This was in an effort to contain as much of the foul stench as possible. Stone peeled back the tape, breaking the seal, and a gust of death pervaded the bank. It's difficult to explain to people who've not smelt a dead body just how strong and overpowering the odor is, and for how long even a burst of it can linger in the air. Stomach churning and sickly sweet. It's the worst thing you will ever smell. Yeah, I can imagine. I've never smelled a dead body, but I know what it smells like. You know when you go to cook some chicken or whatever and it's slightly off and you're like, oh, that's not good. So you throw it in the bin and then, you don't empty the bin for a couple of days. Then you open up the bin and you're like, oh God. So I can only imagine like bodies is like that times 100. Stone turned on his flashlight and stepped into the vault, followed closely by Drake, who was filming the entire thing on a camcorder. In the right-hand corner of the vault were 6 large plastic black barrels. On top of the lids of these barrels were various knives, a pair of rubber gloves, and a pair of handcuffs. On the left-hand side of the vault was a lounge chair, a tray with more knives on it, a handsaw, a man's belt, and 3 large bottles of hydrochloric acid. There were also a couple of full garbage bags, and with utter futility, a spray can of air freshener. Given the situation and the stench in the air, there was little doubt that the black barrels contained human remains. At 2:30 p.m., Steve McCoy ordered everyone to exit the bank and made a phone call to his department back in Adelaide, calling for backup. Chief Superintendent Paul Schramm, head of major crimes, got the call. "Boss," McCoy said, "we've got bodies." Schramm assembled a team, determined to go to Snowtown, and lead it himself. A few hours later, in the early evening of May the 20th, 24 more law enforcement officials drove into Snowtown. The cops spent the next few hours readying their equipment and formulating a plan. Locals were told that the cops were investigating a drugs bust to avoid undue alarm and to stave off the media circus for as long as possible. At 9 p.m., CSI technicians entered the bank. This time, they were in full hazmat suits. Fun fact, much of the rotting odors off corpses are particulates. In other words, the miasmas you're inhaling into your lungs are actually tiny pieces of dead bodies floating through the air. Yeah, that's how I feel about poos. Like, that smell. I'm like, breathe through your nose. At least maybe the nose is filtering out those bits of shit. Or dead body. Chief Schramm gave the order to open one of the barrels. Senior Constable Drake stepped forward. He unscrewed one of the plastic lids. Even though he was a veteran forensics officer wearing a full hazmat suit, Drake recoiled from the ever-intensifying stench, exclaiming, "Crikey, that's rank." Wait, how can he smell it? He's in full hazmat. That means there's like oxygen coming in from like a little tank, right? Or is he just like, he knows, he can imagine. You can just imagine what that smells like, can't you? Because you're like, oh no, oh God. Floating in a necrotic soup of hydrochloric acid, corroded flesh, and human excrement were several limbs, 2 torsos, 2 skulls, and the bobbing scraps of human intestines. Oh, dude. The other 5 barrels were unsealed to reveal similarly gruesome sights. The perpetrators, whoever they might be, were stupid enough to use the wrong kind of acid. Hydrochloric acid is a pretty weak reducing agent and is generally not used to break down organic materials. You got to use lye, isn't it? The drain cleaning one? That's it, because like you put that stuff down your drain and it dissolves all the hair that's in there, that's been trapped and causing your shower to block up or whatever. That's what you use. Lye. You're welcome, serial killers. The killers should have used sulfuric acid or nitric acid. I think it is sulfuric acid. Isn't lye sulfuric acid? Instead, the hydrochloric acid had preserved some of the flesh on the bodies, tightening it to the bones as if they were mummified. Perhaps the reason why the barrels were stored in the bank was because the murderers thought the acid was taking longer to break down the bodies than anticipated. Thus, they had tried to dispose of the evidence and wound up creating a nausea-inducing homing beacon for law enforcement instead. Detective McCoy later recalled, quote, "The stench was unbearable. It permeated your hair, your clothing, everything you had on you, the stench got into. It was horrific, it was putrid." Yeah, you can just imagine it getting into your skin, can't you? Like, that's the sort of thing. It's like, I'll just go home and it'll be like, my beard smells of bodies. Well, goodbye beard, we're growing another one. At 2 a.m., the barrels were resealed. They were full of liquid and could not be easily moved, and they certainly could not be turned on their sides and rolled out of the bank, lest they begin to leak their foul content. A handcart was retrieved, and one by one, the barrels were brought out to a police trailer parked on the street. From there, the 6 barrels, along with other evidence found in the bank, were taken to police headquarters in Adelaide. By 4:30 a.m., everything was assembled in a forensics lab for further examination. They still had no clear idea who the bodies in the barrels had been. Meanwhile, there remained the task of hunting down the perpetrators of this hideous crime and bringing them to justice. Once the senseless and sadistic details of the murders had been revealed, they were almost as sickening as the dismembered remains, entombed in gallons of greyish-green soup that the police had discovered in the unsuspecting rural community of Snowtown. Meet John Bunting. John Bunting was born on September 4th, 1966, in the city of Brisbane, Queensland. David specifies land, not Lund. Queensland. I feel like that's just my British pronunciation. It'd be like, I think I can pronounce it Queensland if I want to. Like, I take effort to say everyone in the UK calls Los Angeles, Los Angeles. And I'm like, okay, I'll call it Los Angeles because everyone got upset. But there's just places, I know it's in different countries and all that, but it's like, I'd say Queensland. Queensland. Sounds weird. He was the only child to Jan and Tom Bunting. Jan was an office worker who was a bit domineering and ran an immaculate household. Tom was a labourer in a printing factory who loved to play guitar until he got some of his fingers cut off in an industrial accident. They lived in the inner city suburb of Inala with high rates of unemployment and even higher rates of crime. It was one of those post-war public housing developments that turned out badly. Brisbane law enforcement used to refer to Inala as the flea pit. Lovely. Nevertheless, the Buntings were employed and lived a solitary life, interacting very rarely with other people in the neighbourhood. They saved up for a vacation every year, usually fishing trips by the coast, including roaming the Great Barrier Reef or driving around and sightseeing the peerless beauty that is so abundant in regional Queensland. By and large, John enjoyed a stable, healthy upbringing that was the envy of the other kids in the flea pit. It's said that Jan and Tom Bunting doted on their son, with John's only complaint about his parents being that his mother didn't respect his privacy, and in general, John spent more time around his father than his mother. When he was a boy, John took an interest in a vast array of pursuits: astronomy, electronics, photography, chemistry, geology, and physics. He and his friend Kurt Bertrand frequently used to visit museums and art galleries. They also photographed the moon through a telescope. In order to indulge John's interest in photography, Tom built his son a darkroom in their home. John made his own bottle rockets and stink bombs. He even built a boat with his father in the backyard. John and his friend Kurt also once secretly built a tunnel underneath the Bunting household, 4 meters below the earth, and braced with wooden beams and bricks, reaching a length of 5 meters before Tom Bunting discovered what his son was doing and forced John to fill the tunnel in. John later wanted to study chemistry and physics in school, but he didn't have the math credits for it. That's awesome. Like, that was my dream. Like, I just loved digging holes when I was a kid. I don't know why. Like, I just loved digging. And it was always like, oh yeah, it'd be cool to dig an underground tunnel. This kid did it. Legend. Wait, is he going to be a horrible murderer? Did I just call him a legend? Oh my god. According to John, when he was 8 years old, he was at a friend's house when they were locked in a room by the friend's older brother. The 2 boys were then strapped down to a bed and sodomized. Oh my lord, this got dark very quickly. John alleges he was beaten and burned with cigarettes. Later, it came out that this older male had been sexually abusing his younger brother for years. Once it was all over, John and his friend were not freed, but remained strapped to the bed. John claims that the older brother got on the phone and said, quote, "I've got these 2 conditioned. "We're going to have a party." John claims that numerous other men in their late teens and early 20s came over to the house and took turns R-wording them. Then his friend's father came home, was enraged at what he saw, freed John, and sent him to the hospital. Oh my god, can you imagine coming home and finding this to be like, what the f*** is going on? Son, you gotta go to prison, my dude. Like, what the f*** is this? John claims that he never dared to tell his parents what had happened, and when he returned home that night with contusions all over his face and body, he said that it had been in an accident. John also claimed that the older brother escaped the wrath of his father by running out of the house, getting on a motorbike, speeding down the street, only to get hit and killed by a bus. Now it sounds like the group of men coming over feels like a bit of a stretch from like a believable but horrific story to like, okay, maybe. And then now he just happens to speed off on a bike and get hit by a bus. Seems rather convenient. Whether this account of childhood sexual abuse is true, we shall never know, since we only have John's word for it. Elements of the story certainly seem quite fanciful. Yeah, I agree, David. It's like that. It seemed to start off as just a horrific story, and then it turned into something like, I'm not sure I believe you anymore. However, it is possible that childhood trauma of some description had occurred and messed John up. By the time John had reached his early teens, it developed an unusually obsessive hatred of both pedophiles and homosexuals. He saw little difference between the two, claiming that most gay men preyed on little boys for lack of options because most men in the world were straight and didn't want to have sex with them. I imagine those boys also didn't. It's quite an unusual opinion to have. Yeah, that's weird. John's contorted psyche started to manifest itself in other ways. He started collecting insects and arachnids, even the highly poisonous redback and funnel web spiders, and drowned them in brake fluid, battery acid, and pool chlorine, just to see them convulse and die. Uh-oh. Get him on that list of people torturing animals. He became fascinated with firearms. He started to take an interest in Adolf Hitler and contacted a neo-Nazi group in Sydney who promptly sent him a copy of Mein Kampf. He later painted a swastika inside the trunk of his car and tried in vain to purchase an SS officer's uniform and a Nazi flag. Bruh. What are you up to? Why are you doing this? The ideology of Nazism had a special appeal for John because of its violent, murderous hostility toward homosexuality. I mean... Like, not that I'm like, yeah, he should hate homosexuals, because obviously that's bad. But it's not like, oh, why do you like Nazis? I just hate homosexuals. Can't you just hate homosexuals and not be a Nazi? Like, or, I mean, best yet, let's not do either. But why does one have to lead to the other? That seems like a bit much. At age 13, John claims he began gay bashing with an older man in his 40s named Benny. The latter had gone through an abusive childhood, been sexually assaulted by his father, who also allegedly cut off some of Benny's toes with bolt cutters. According to John, Benny got him to wait on a street corner at night in downtown Brisbane as bait. When a man approached John, thinking he was a rent boy, Benny would emerge from the shadows and beat the ever-loving shit out of the man. Again, it's unclear whether any of this is true or just a figment of John Bunting's feverish imagination. When John was 15, he got a girl named Lisa pregnant. She had a daughter named Tammy. Lisa passed Tammy off as the daughter of her older boyfriend and moved in with him. The relationship lasted 2 years before the boyfriend discovered the paternity fraud and tossed Lisa and Tammy out on the street. Soon after, the mother and daughter moved to England. John had next to nothing to do with the child when she was born, and as an adult, he never contacted Tammy and seldom spoke of her existence. When John was 17, he dropped out of high school at the start of year 12. I'm assuming it runs like UK years 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay, so 17 years old, 16, 17 years old, if I'm not mistaken. The first job was for a signwriting business. The next was for a repairman for a Brisbane-based sporting goods company. John would travel all over Australia, putting up and repairing volleyball, football, rugby, and ground hockey nets at various sports centres and gymnasiums. He even made it as far as Tasmania. I don't know, is that far? I've never been to Australia. Its geography is a bit of a mystery to me. I know it's massive and everything's like really spread out. Whenever John was back in Queensland, he would link back up with Benny and engage in various criminal activities. According to John, they continued gay bashing. They also broke into the houses of convicted or suspected pedophiles, trashed the place, killed any pets, and smeared a word that I probably don't want to say this early in the video. It begins with an F and continues to agate, in shit on the wall. John claimed to have even killed a few pedos, but the latter claim is unverified and likely untrue. John was known to run his mouth relentlessly and spin wild-sounding yarns. John quit the net repair job and started working at a crematorium. He moved into a house that he shared with his friend, Mark Day, who remembered John as bragging about his gay bashing but didn't really believe much of it at the time. In early 1985, when John was 18, his friend/mentor Benny was diagnosed with throat cancer, hospitalized, and died soon after, but it's unclear whether Benny even existed at all. The following year, in February 1986, Mark Day and John Bunting planned an epic road trip that would take them down into the states of New South Wales, Victoria, and then on to South Australia, and ultimately wind up in the city of Perth in Western Australia. Indeed, if you want to cross Australia by car, you're better off heading south first and then continuing along the civilized coastline. God forbid you take the tiny roads directly across the outback, where an inexperienced driver runs the risk of breaking down, being out of mobile range, and dying of dehydration before anybody comes past, or else simply getting robbed and murdered and never found again. Oh my god. Is the outback that bad? I imagine you could break down and there's no one there, and so you die of exposure or whatever, or dehydration, that kind of thing. But just getting murdered? It's there's a car coming past. They could rescue me or they could murder me. Some Wild West Australia. The expedition involved a total of 10 people, 7 young adults and 3 children. The latter technically included Mark Day's 14-year-old pregnant girlfriend, Esme Kennedy. Mark was 18 years old. 16 was the age of consent in Queensland, with no close-in-age exemption. Also, they're not close in age. They're 14 and 18. That ain't f***ing right. The relationship was completely illegal. Esme should have also been in school. Yeah, no shit, she's 14. Did he say that she's pregnant? Jesus Christ. What are you up to? The car carrying John, Mark, Esme, and 2 other young people, Kevin and Michelle, made it as far as Adelaide in South Australia before the car finally broke down, unable to be revived without professional repairs and new parts bought at great expense. So the party of 5 lived in a caravan park to the north of the city for a few weeks, while the other car carried on to Perth. Adelaide was pleasant enough. It's definitely the most underrated of the 5 major Australian cities. It's often overlooked, with most people just rocking up to Sydney to see the Opera House, Harbour Bridge and other historical landmarks, and Melbourne to see, the tram lines, a play, and eat at a vegan restaurant or some shit like that, and whatever else those champagne-swilling communist agitators do down there. David, spicy. I don't know enough about Australia to get the jokes, but I assume this is some, in Australia jokey vibes. Just kidding. Sort of just kidding. Meanwhile, the weather in Adelaide is good. Not too hot, not too cold. The city is large and cosmopolitan, with all the amenities and bars and restaurants a young person might desire. But not too big that prices are too high, or everyone in the city is a sharp-elbowed arsehole. Some obnoxious millennials and zoomers have taken to calling the city Radelaide because it's so rad. Wait, really? I used to... Me and my contemporaries, when we were at school, would say rad in the 90s. That's still a thing? Rad, bro. John Bunting got a job working as a handyman at a car museum and therefore decided to stay for good. After a few weeks in the caravan park, Esme miscarried her baby. In the aftermath, she broke up with Mark, who promptly returned to Brisbane. Meanwhile, John and Esme fell into a relationship. Again, a reminder, Esme was only 14 and should have been in school, and moreover, the age of consent in South Australia was actually 17. John Bunting was nearly 20. The f***, man. No. Half your age plus 7. 20, 10, 17. If you're 20 years old, you could date someone who's 17, and it's not too weird, and it's legal. Importantly. Such was Bunting's selective attitude towards child predation. After a year, John and Esme broke up, and she returned to Brisbane. Thereupon, John, Kevin, and Michelle rented a house together in Adelaide's rather rough and impoverished northern suburbs. In 1988, when John was 21, the car museum informed him that they could no longer afford to keep him employed, but they wrote him a fairly stellar reference, which allowed him to get another job at an industrial abattoir called the South Australia Meat Corporation. I would very much prefer being in the car museum. We were your great reference, so you got to go be around dead animals all day, whereas before you're just looking at nice cars. No. John Bunting worked at the evisceration table, removing spleens, bladders, intestines, and other offals. Other offal. I don't know. No. I don't want to do that job. That doesn't sound nice. Bunting would later boast that his favourite part of the job was slaughtering the animals. Just f***ed up, bro. But there's no record with the company that he ever worked in that position. Meanwhile, Kevin and Michelle didn't really appreciate having Bunting as a housemate. He was constantly raving about how he wanted to beat up or kill pedophiles and homosexuals. With his wages from the abattoir, he amassed a large collection of handguns, rifles, and shotguns that he kept under his bed. Kevin also discovered in the attic above the laundry room that Bunting had concealed a blowtorch, a bottle of poison, a length of rope, a knife with a curved blade, and a balaclava. He's got a little murder kit up there, a torture murder kit, what the f***. Then one afternoon, Bunting killed Kevin's pet bull terrier and hung it in the shed. He admitted doing it to Michelle. To avoid confrontation that could turn violent, Michelle agreed to tell Kevin that the dog had run away. The fuck you doing, mate? Why are you doing this to his dog? In January 1989, when John was 22, he signed up for a metalworking course offered at the abattoir. It was there that he met 18-year-old Veronica Tripp, who had hearing and vision problems and intellectual disability and was functionally illiterate. They regularly went to the movies together, but Veronica claimed that Bunting always picked the movies, and they were invariably violent. When Veronica turned 19, she moved out of her parents' place and into a house with Bunting, and into the house with Bunting, Kevin, and Michelle. A few months later, in September 1989, Veronica Tripp and John Bunting got married at a registry office. While living together, Veronica claims that Bunting often flew into a rage, but was never physically violent toward her. She also claims that John wanted sex every day, but wasn't particularly kinky or depraved. No hint of the wanton sadism that he displayed towards animals. Yeah, it's like, if... It's not an attractive quality, is it? It's like, oh, what do you do for hobbies? Oh, I really love my job. It's like, oh, what are you into? I work in an abattoir at the evisceration table. Oh, and what do you do on weekends? Oh, I just continue. I just kill dogs. Dude, it's fucking weird, man. On December the 14th, 1991, John and Veronica moved out and got a place of their own on 203 Waterloo Corner Road in the sketchy suburb of Salisbury North, yet another government housing estate gone wrong, much like the Brisbane suburb of Inala, in which John grew up. Soon afterward, John's parents, Jan and Tom Bunting, moved down to Adelaide to be near their son. They rented a house nearby, also in Salisbury North. Jan didn't think much of Veronica, but in turn, Veronica's father, Jim, had a huge dislike for John Bunting. Jim said, quote, "He's got a cruel, filthy mouth, and I think he's trouble." Well, Jim, you bang on, mate. Meet the neighbours. Bunting's decision to move to Waterloo Corner Road in the North Adelaide suburbs was a fateful one. His neighbours, in Salisbury North, were a real who's who of what's that smell, a veritable hive of scum and villainy, a gaggle of bogans, hard knocks, and petty criminals who were often emotionally damaged and even mentally deranged. Many of them were also easily manipulated and would eventually become Bunting's accomplices. Others would become his victims. Now let's first start with Robert Joe Wagner. He was born in November 1971 in New South Wales. His mother relocated Robert and his sister to Adelaide in 1974. As a child, Robert was regularly beaten by his mum's new boyfriend, and when Robert was 7, he was sexually abused by the teenage son of one of his mother's friends. Robert didn't talk about what happened. In fact, he barely spoke at all for several months. And then, still at the shockingly young age of 7, Robert attempted to end his life by taking an overdose of his mother's sleeping pills. After that, Robert was never quite the same. He struggled at school and was functionally illiterate, even being held back a year in primary school. In 1984, at the age of 13, Robert stopped turning up to school altogether. Robert then ran riot around the neighborhood, disappearing for days at a time, with his mother frequently reporting him missing to the police. In mid-1985, Robert Wagner, still just 13 years old, met 30-year-old Vanessa Lane and spent days at a time at Vanessa's house, which was in Salisbury North. They formed a sexual relationship. 13 and 30. That's just straight up pedo. I mean, obviously. Jesus Christ. This wasn't just because of the blatant statutory rape. Vanessa Lane was a male-to-female transgender born in Snowtown in 1955 under the name Barry Wayne Venables. Lane's father was a violent alcoholic, and Lane's mother, Sylvia, was extremely neglectful, almost causing her child to die of malnutrition. Lane briefly spent time in foster care before Lane's grandmother won guardianship, raising Lane in poverty in the mining town of Port Pirie. At the age of 9, Lane began dressing up in a hot pink skirt and fishnet stockings, much to her grandmother's confusion and chagrin. At age 11, Lane came out to friends and shortly thereafter initiated sexual relations with some of them. By 15, Lane was walking the streets of Port Pirie, waving at men in their cars who slowed down, honked, and yelled catcalls. Lane's grandmother did not approve of Vanessa's sexual relations with the neighborhood boys, and Lane's mother, Sylvia, who also lived in Port Pirie, began claiming that Vanessa Lane wasn't her child, but that they'd somehow gotten her mixed up in the maternity ward. When Lane was 17, she departed on a cross-country trip, living in Adelaide, Sydney, and Melbourne. To pay the bills, Vanessa Lane worked as a gardener and landscaper for 2 weeks before claiming she permanently injured her back in order to collect disability funds. Fraud was, and still is, a big problem in the Australian welfare system. Now, in late 1980, when Vanessa Lane was 25, she was arrested for sexual assault of 2 boys under the age of 12. Lane was sentenced to just 4 months imprisonment. Bro. 25-year-olds sexually assaulting 2 12-year-olds and you get 4 months in prison. Are you joking? That should be years. The judge explained that the shortness of the sentence was in light of Lane's gender dysphoria. Quote, "I am aware that you have medical problems and problems in establishing your own identity." Yeah, fine. That's all fine, no problem with that. But that doesn't mean that you can go and sexually assault children, does it? Now, people can understand and have sympathy for that, but it does not permit you to go around doing these sort of things for your own gratification. Yeah, obviously not, so throw the book at her. Don't give her 4 months for sexually assaulting 2 children. What the judge? In turn, Lane declared at the sentencing that the reason why she had perpetrated the crime was because she was mentally traumatized by her family not accepting her lifestyle. Look, and again, comes up all the time on Casual Criminalist, there are plenty of families that don't accept their children's lifestyles. And it's bad. It's not good. But not an excuse to go and sexually assault children. Lane was sent to an all-male prison, where, as a convicted pedophile, the inmates spat in her food, shouted insults and threats, and frequently inflicted violence upon her. Oh no! After being released, Vanessa Lane moved to Salisbury North in Adelaide, where Lane was witnessed on multiple occasions approaching underage boys. It wasn't long before Lane gained a reputation, with the house frequently being vandalized or pelted with rocks, and with Lane herself being the recipient of loud insults when she walked down the street. Vanessa Lane was ordered by a judge to attend counselling sessions, but when the counsellor tried to delve into the cause of Lane's paedophilia, she declared, quote, "This feels like a church confessional and isn't going anywhere," and promptly stopped attending. 5 years later, in 1985, Vanessa Lane, now 30 years old, met 13-year-old Robert Wagner and formed a sexual relationship. This is so f***ed up. Stop it. When Wagner's mother Carol found out, she forbade her son from seeing Vanessa. Robert ignored this demand, so Carol went over to Vanessa Lane's house and confronted the both of them. Robert said he wanted to stay with Vanessa, who was holding Robert's arm and stroking his chest. Carol went home and phoned the police. Robert was brought home, but Vanessa wasn't immediately charged. Why not? Charge her! Come on! However, it was only a matter of time until, should the relationship continue, Vanessa would be arrested for the sexual abuse of a minor and sent back to prison. And so, in January of 1986, 2 months after Robert had turned 14, he and Vanessa ran away together. They disappeared without a trace. Robert's mother didn't hear a word from her son for nearly 4 years. Vanessa Lane and Robert Wagner returned to Salisbury North in late 1989, shortly after Robert had turned 18 years old. With the age of consent in South Australia being 17, the police could no longer do anything about the relationship, and Wagner vowed that he'd deny any allegations of being groomed or kidnapped. Police did not pursue the matter further. The now 34-year-old Vanessa permitted Robert to resume contact with his mother. But Lane never allowed Robert to visit Carol when Vanessa was not also present. Lane and Wagner rented a house together on Bingham Road in Salisbury North, across the street from an elementary school. Neither of them worked. By this point, Wagner had also figured out how to feign a physical illness to collect disability payments. Lane no longer dressed in stereotypically female clothing, but presented as male, but still preferred to be addressed as Vanessa, although sometimes she would occasionally insist on being called Barry. Lane and Wagner lived in a house with several pet cats, which they did not clean up after, resulting in the house reeking of piss and shit. Lovely. Because Lane and Wagner were periodically the targets of vandals, they bought 2 large Rottweilers for security. Yep, that's going to work. Rottweilers are scary, man. They did not clean up after the rather sizable digestive leavings of these animals either. The couple would also perform acts of bestiality on the dogs, with Wagner holding down one of the canines while Lane violated it. The fuck? Why do we have to have bestiality in here as well? It's already sick enough. Sometime in the intervening 4 years, Robert Wagner had become a neo-Nazi. Oh, there we go. He named one of his Rottweilers Adolf and had a screensaver on his computer that read, "Adolf Hitler is still alive." This seems unlikely, given that in 1989 Hitler would have been 100 years old, but I digress. Yes, he also shot himself, and they know that. It's confirmed. In 1989, Wagner joined a group called National Action, Australia's answer to the KKK. Wagner wanted to have a swastika tattooed on his forehead, but no tattoo artist in Adelaide would do it. Good for you, tattoo artists. Someone comes in being like, "I want a swastika." Be like, "Not here, mate. We're not that kind of tattoo shop." Wagner was thrown out of National Action after only a year for being, quote, "too radical for the group. Too radical for Australia's KKK, huh?" Oh no. When John and Veronica Bunting moved to Waterloo Corner Road on the 14th of December 1991, they met their next-door neighbour, Robert Skews, a welfare recipient in his mid-50s who suffered brain damage at birth and had spent a good portion of his adult life homeless in Sydney. It was Skews who, that same evening, introduced John to Vanessa Lane and Robert Wagner. Wayne and Wagner helped John Bunting move his stuff into the house. John's initial instinct was to despise Lane and Wagner since they were same-sex attracted, and it was clear that Lane was an unrepentant pedophile. However, as they talked, Bunting realized that Wagner not only shared his affinity for Nazism, but that Wagner had also been sexually abused as a child. As such, Bunting quickly felt that he and Wagner were kindred spirits. Meanwhile, Bunting tolerated Vanessa Lane, especially once it became clear that Lane was able to provide inside information on Adelaide's bevy of other child predators. Lane and Wagner were seen frequently at Bunting's house from that point forward. Shortly after moving in, John Bunting befriended another neighbour, 33-year-old Mark Ray Hayden, whom he met at a metalworking course in 1992. Born Mark Ray Lawrence in December 1958, he was raised mostly by his father, Edward Lawrence. His mother was schizophrenic and frequently institutionalized. Mark's father worked at the General Motors Holden factory. In 1997, when Mark was 18, his dad got him a job there, spray painting cars, but Mark lasted only 2 years on the job before getting fired for stealing. From that point forward, he refused to ever work again and went on welfare. He managed to scam a carer's pension out of the government, claiming that he looked after him. Mark Hayden was also barely educated and had been described by people who knew him as slow, speaking only in monosyllables, if and when he spoke at all. He spent his days drinking and tinkering with cars. Another neighbour Bunting got to know was 52-year-old Jeffrey Williams, another permanent welfare recipient. Williams would regularly have Lane, Wagner, and Bunting over to his house. However, Bunting didn't like the man, suggesting that Williams was gay. According to Veronica Bunting, her husband once spray-painted the offensive word, I'm probably far enough into this video, fag on the fence in front of Williams's house. Bunting also fantasized about murdering Jeffrey Williams and filling Williams's house with the bodies of other quote-unquote undesirables and cutting a hole in Williams's throat into which Bunting would insert a chihuahua. What the f***? It's incredibly weirdly specific. Bunting found the mental image of barking at a corpse to be hilarious. Happy Pants. In the spring of 1992, John Bunting was introduced to 18-year-old Clinton Douglas Tresize. He was born on the wrong side of the tracks in Adelaide on the 5th of December 1973. Clinton's parents got divorced when he was 3, and his mother put Clinton and his brother Scott into the childcare system. His sister, Sherry, stayed with their mother. For the first few years, Clinton's mother paid weekly visits to the boys' home where Clinton was staying. For the first few years, Clinton's mother paid weekly visit to the boys' home where Clinton was staying. His father also kept periodic contact, but for the most part, Clinton was raised by child welfare officers and later a sequence of foster guardians. Like many of the people mentioned here, Clinton's formal education was extremely limited. In the early years, Clinton frequented a number of evangelical churches, but ultimately decided that Christianity wasn't for him. When he did hit puberty, Clinton realized he was gay, which caused some friction with his family, as did Clinton's decision to drop out of school and run away from his foster home. Nevertheless, his mother, father, and sister kept up periodic contact with him. In early 1990, Clinton was 16, homeless, and drifting around Adelaide. It was then that he made the acquaintance of Vanessa Lane, whose interest in Tresize was obviously sexual. Not long afterward, Clinton Tresize managed to scam himself some disability payments and move into government housing in the rough northern Adelaide suburb of Elizabeth, not far from Lane and Wagner in Salisbury North. Like many of his neighbours, Tresize largely lived in his own filth, with half-empty cans of food and pet feces strewn about the place. Putrid smell of rot perpetually filled the house. However, in an attempt to get his life together, Clinton Tresize began taking night classes to make up for the shortfall of his childhood education. There, he befriended a fellow student named Stephen, but the friendship ended abruptly after Clinton sexually propositioned him. When in 1992, Lane and Wagner introduced John Bunting to the now 18-year-old Tresize, and Bunting immediately loathed the young man. Though John tolerated Wagner, and to a lesser extent Lane, at least in principle, Bunting hated homosexuals. Also, he said, Tresize had bleached blonde hair, wore bright orange nail polish, and usually clothed himself in neon-crusted fabrics. He was openly gay and acted effeminately. Bunting contemptuously dubbed Tresize Happy Pants on account of his flame red and purple trousers that he often wore. On July 10, 1992, Clinton Tresize visited the Department of Family and Community Services to speak with a financial counselor. On the 22nd of July, Tresize withdrew some money for his bank account. That's the last record we have of him being alive. After that, the government disability deposits just started stacking up in his account. Now, sometime between the end of July and the end of August 1992, John and Veronica Bunting paid a visit to the household of Wagner and Lane on Bingham Road for afternoon tea. Wagner, Lane, and John all chatted while Veronica played with one of the cats on the filthy, feces-laden floor. After an hour, Wagner, Lane, and Bunting got up to leave, with John commanding Veronica to wait at Lane and Wagner's house. That got Bunting's wife out of the way. After all, she had an intellectual disability and wouldn't ask too many questions. The trio then proceeded to John's house on Waterloo Corner, where they agreed to meet Clinton Tresize, have a few beers, and hang out. While Tresize was sitting with a drink on the living room sofa, John Bunting crept up behind him and struck Tresize in the back of the head with a shovel. Tresize fell to the floor. Bunting then set about bludgeoning the victim multiple times with a hammer, cracking the back of the boy's skull open. Because the blows with the hammer were so fierce, the front side of the victim's skull, which was resting against the floor, was also fractured. Clinton Tresize's death was not instantaneous. At some point, the victim raised his left hand to defend himself, only for it to be struck with the hammer. But the young man wasn't tortured over the course of several hours, like many of Bunting's later victims. Oh, good. So we got that to look forward to, have we? Just, it's not enough that he's fracturing this kid's skull. Jesus. After Tresize was dead, Bunting wrapped up his corpse in black garbage bags. Wagner and Lane helped Bunting throw Tresize's body into the back of Bunting's station wagon. By this time, Wagner was completely under Bunting's spell and was all for the brutal murder of homosexuals. This might sound like a contradiction, and it is, but lately, Wagner had become more emotionally distant from Lane and point-blank refused to take the submissive role in sex anymore. Lane, meanwhile, was simply too terrified not to go along with things. It's also possible that Bunting had some leverage over Lane about her more recent activities with underage local boys. Bunting, Wagner, and Lane drove the station wagon 20 minutes from Salisbury North to the rural township of Lower Light. They pulled into a sheep paddock and dug a shallow grave. Thereupon, Tresize was unceremoniously dumped into the hole and covered in a layer of soil. Bunting wiped his hands on his jeans, turned around, and walked toward the station wagon without looking back. The trio returned to Wagner and Lane's house, where they found Veronica asleep on the couch. Bunting took her home. Sometime afterward, Bunting broke into Tresize's house and stole his television and other electronics. On August the 31st, Clinton Tresize's father, Doug, and sister, Sherry, paid a visit to Clinton's house because they hadn't heard from him in a while. They found the house in a messy state, but most of Tresize's personal effects were still there. They took note of the smell of rotten food and feces. A few months later, when the rent was not paid to the South Australia Housing Trust, Doug and Sherry removed Tresize's stuff from the property. Sherry Tresize later claimed that she'd filed a missing persons report, but no record of it exists. It's very odd. Like, the person clearly seems to be missing, and he's your family. There's no record of you filing a missing persons report, and you're just like, oh no, I did. It's like, that doesn't seem... Are you not more concerned? Conversely, police assert that because there may have been some friction in the family in recent years, they did not immediately report Tresize missing and merely assumed that he had gone off somewhere, and that Sherry's later assertion was to avoid embarrassment. But he just left his house and all of his belongings? What about his, ID? What about money? He just took nothing? It's very weird. Like, if I go missing and my phone and bank card and ID and driver's license and stuff are also gone, then it's like, I've gone somewhere. If that stuff's still at home, it's like, I've been kidnapped and murdered. Because who the leaves their house without that stuff? Especially for a longer time. Indeed, Sherry and Clinton did not get on well, and so she did not visit regularly. This latter version of events seems to be borne out by the testimony of Clinton Tresize's brother Scott, who would later say, I just thought he'd got jack of all the shit that was going on in his life and decided he was better off away from it all and picked up and moved away. I just thought he'd gone for a different change of life. It was a very difficult sentence to read, Scott. A few weeks after the murder, Vanessa Lane approached Veronica Bunting and said that she'd seen John kill a friend of theirs. Lane appeared to be terrified and begged Veronica not to tell John Bunting. But she did, and her husband denied it. A little later, Vanessa Lane approached Veronica again and described the murder in greater detail, identifying the victim as Happy Pants. Veronica again related this story to Bunting. This time, he didn't bother to deny it. To quote Veronica, John told me parts of what they did. John said that he took someone up to Lower Light and buried them in a hole. His name was Clinton Tresize. I've never told anybody about this conversation as I didn't want to get killed. I believed that if I did tell somebody, John would kill me. John was not particularly upset that Veronica found out. He merely ordered her to keep her mouth shut. He felt confident that she'd do as she was told. Meanwhile, Bunting concealed his fury at the fact that Vanessa Lane kept running her mouth. One day, John vowed he would dispose of her. Yeah, Vanessa Lane is just very what's her name? The other one, Veronica, is like, oh my God, I know. And if I say anything, he's going to kill me. And Vanessa Lane's just like, yo, he's murdering people. Vanessa, you're going to get killed. In the autumn of 1992, John Bunting began digging a tunnel under 203 Waterloo Corner Road. He told his wife it was for an underground bunker. Again, this guy just likes to dig in tunnels. I also like digging tunnels. Veronica did not pursue this matter with any questions. After a few weeks of digging, Bunting enlisted the help of his son Mark Hayden, whose job it was to ferry the bucketful of stones and dirt to the surface. Earlier in 1992, Hayden had gotten married to a woman named Christina, and during the summer, they'd had a son together. However, by the end of 1992, the marriage was over. The otherwise quiet Mark Hayden was well known for his extremely foul temper. In early 1993, Robert Wagner joined the excavation, swinging a pickaxe, shifting the heavier boulders, and carrying heavy wooden beams. Bunting briefly tried to teach Wagner to read, but gave up once Wagner got bored. Due to the intensive work involved in digging the tunnel, Hayden, Wagner and Lane, who jealously refused to be left home alone, almost became permanent fixtures at Bunting's house. Bunting also regularly invited strangers into his home, mostly delinquent teenagers and drug addicts, much to Veronica's mounting frustration. It's like, dude, what are you up to? Why are you digging a hole underneath the house? And who are these random drug addict teenagers doing here? And why did you murder someone? Oh God, Veronica, I don't want to be in your position. This is up. Bunting also brought home a menagerie of stray animals, including a female German shepherd that he named Kelly. In order to avoid mowing the lawn, Bunting also brought home a sheep that he'd stolen from the South Australia Meat Corporation, where he continued to work. That sheep's probably like, yes. Going from a life of literally at the abattoir to, and about to be put on his eviscerating table, to just chilling out in his garden and eating grass. Well, at least the sheep ended up happy. Bunting was the only one in his circle of friends who actually had a job. However, in 1993, Bunting broke his arm in a motorcycle accident and had to take several weeks off from working at the abattoir. Once Bunting recovered, instead of returning to the meat factory, he and Hayden got jobs pouring molten iron at the local foundry. After a few months, Bunting quit working there, claiming to have hurt his back. He tried to get on disability, but unlike what seems to be everybody else in the f***ing neighborhood, Bunting was unsuccessful. Instead, John refused to work anymore and went on job seeker benefits, which is a decidedly less generous handout than disability payments and, at least in theory, was supposed to be much more temporary. Yeah, job seeker is like you've got to be looking for a job, right? I think you've got to, like, I've not ever been on it, but at least in the UK, you've got to show, like, evidence that you've been applying for jobs and stuff and trying to get off it, because you can't be on it forever. Job seeker paid his food and rent, which was already low thanks to the South Australia's Housing Trust, and John scrounged additional money for his car, guns, drugs, and booze by going out with Robert Wagner, breaking into houses and stealing people's electronics for resale. Meanwhile, the undiscovered body of Clinton Tresize continued to rot in a farmer's field. Meet Elizabeth Harvey. In March of 1994, the now 27-year-old John Bunting met 40-year-old Elizabeth Harvey, another unfortunate who would fall under Bunting's spell. She was born Christine Ann Eude in September 1953. When Christine was only a child, her mother left her father and ran away with a man who turned out to be an abusive drunk. For several years, Christine and her siblings were regularly beaten and sexually abused by this man, an ordeal that was only cut short when he suddenly dropped dead of a heart attack. Nevertheless, the psychological damage was already done, imbuing Christine with chronic depression and hypersexuality. She attempted suicide at the age of 15. In 1970, when she was 17, Christine started a 6-year-long affair with an older married man. At age 23, Christine fell pregnant, and the man broke things off and told her he wanted nothing to do with the child. When Christine asked him how she would explain the pregnancy to her mother, he replied, quote, "Look for 3 wise men and the Star of Bethlehem." Christine, Jesus Christ, piece of shit of the year. I mean, internet, like, normally I'm like, that guy's such a piece of shit, but we've got John fucking Bunting in this episode, don't we? He's already smashed someone's face in with a shovel. So this guy's basically a legend compared to him. But no, he's also a piece of shit. Christine's first son, Troy Eude, was born on August 30th, 1976. 3 years later, in early 1979, Christine answered an ad looking for a housemaid in the newspaper and flew out to Broken Hill, New South Wales to meet a potential employer, a 43-year-old named Spyros Vassakis. He owned a struggling Greek restaurant. Vassakis picked Christine up from the airport and immediately took her on a dinner date. Instead of becoming his housemaid, 3 months later, Christine became his wife. Holy shit, okay. Soon after, the Greek restaurant went belly up and the couple relocated to Adelaide. Spyros refused to get a new job and the couple went on welfare and moved into government housing. The marriage was not a happy one. Wait, so this guy went from looking to hire a housemaid, like domestic staff, to being on benefits, essentially. Bruh, your life went downhill real quick. The marriage was not a happy one, with Spyros practicing marital rape on a regular basis. Jesus Christ. There are so many pieces of shit in today's episode. It's quite something. As a result of one of these coerced unions, Christine gave birth to their son, Jamie, on December the 24th, 1979. She gave birth to another son, Adrian, in 1981. That year, Christine briefly moved into a separate dwelling provided by the South Australian Housing Trust, but stayed married to Spiros, with the children bouncing between them. Vlasakis sexually abused both his stepson Troy Yude and his biological son Jamie. Oh my god, Spiros, you go from like piece of shit to bigger piece of shit to total piece of shit. After 18 months, Christine moved back in with Spiros, who immediately started raping her again. Christine fell pregnant and gave birth to their youngest son, Christopher, in 1985. Then at 3 a.m. on June the 13th, 1986, Spiros Vlasakis dropped dead of a heart attack. Oh no! What a shame! Spiros is dead! Yes! Just like Christine's abusive stepfather had done years prior. Their son, Jamie, 6 years old, watched him die. Is David implying that Christine's killing them? I don't think so, right? But it's good that these people die because they're horrible pieces of shit. Within 2 months, Christine was looking for a new man. She quickly met Marcus Johnson, a middle-aged divorcee who was working at a car factory. To shake off the name Christine Vlasakis, she legally changed it to Elizabeth Harvey. Okay, most people normally just would change the surname back to their maiden name or whatever, but she's like, nah, going for a whole new identity. Marcus was decent to Elizabeth, aka Christine, and they stayed in a common law relationship for several years, during which Elizabeth's eldest son, Troy Yude, reached adolescence and started sexually abusing his younger half-brother, Jamie Vlasakis. Why? And I mean, yes, it's because he's super f***ed up because of fucking Spyro. Like, don't f*** up your kids. How many times? Elizabeth and Marcus were not aware of this at the time. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Harvey fell into multiple depressive episodes, aggravated by the fact that Marcus asked her to get 2 abortions. Marcus Johnson didn't want any more children. He already had 3 kids from his previous marriage that ended in 1980, one of whom, David Johnson, had come to live with Marcus, Elizabeth, and her 4 sons. But Elizabeth resented having to get abortions. Numerous fights and separations dotted their declining relationship. Well, I'll tell you what, if you don't want kids and you don't want abortions, let me introduce you to the novel concept of fucking birth control. Marcus and Elizabeth finally married in 1992, hoping that it would resuscitate things. No. It's a bad idea. It's like people who are like, well, my marriage isn't going very well, so let's have another kid and see if that fixes things. It's not going to fix things. Kids make marriages harder, because kids are hard. It's like, I love my kids. I love my wife. But, like, kids are hard work, man. It's like, it's a lot. Elizabeth, already thinking of getting a divorce before the marriage license was even signed, decided to keep her adopted surname Harvey. Meanwhile, Elizabeth had become hooked on Valium, gambling, and shopping binges to deal with her depression. Marcus and Elizabeth divorced after 10 months of marriage. Elizabeth Harvey was left to raise her 4 sons on her own, impoverished, living in Salisbury North, strung out on benzos and suffering from mental illness. Then, in autumn of 1993, she found a lump in one of her breasts and underwent testing for breast cancer. A few months later, in November, Elizabeth's mother died of throat cancer, is that the second person to die of throat cancer in today's episode? God damn. Sending Elizabeth into a full-blown nervous breakdown. She was sent to a mental ward. Her neighbor, Jeffrey Payne, looked after her sons while she was locked up, but it turned out that Jeffrey Payne was a pedo. What the? How? Is Australia just pedophiles? Like, what the fuck's going on in Australia? He targeted 13-year-old Jamie Vlasakis and threatened to hurt Jamie's brothers and kill his mother if Jamie did not comply. How about you don't leave your children with random neighbours? Jeffrey Payne, the pedo. After a few months, Elizabeth Harvey was released from the mental ward. Also, it turned out that the tumour in her breast was benign. God, that's got to be scary, right? When you're like, what's this lump? And then they're like, oh, it's benign. You're like, yes. I remember I had a lump in my neck. It's gone now, but it was there for a while. And I'm like, oh God, I'm definitely dying. I'm definitely dying. And I went to the doctor and he's like, don't even need to biopsy that. It's just like a lymph node that's swollen and it'll go down. Don't worry about it. And I'm like, oh, thank God. And like a few months later, it just disappeared into like basically nothing. And it's like, it's one of those things where you're just like, I'm definitely going to die. I think I must have been like in my early 20s. And I was like, I'm definitely going to die. And they're like, mate, it's nothing. It's just a swollen lymph node. I'm like, yes! Yeah, I feel like I've survived cancer. And it was just, I don't know. I'm a hypochondriac. I'm always like any little thing. And it's like, well, that's it for me. Game over. But she was still in poor shape mentally and was oblivious to what was going on between Payne and her son. But help came from the most unlikely quarter. Convicted child predator Vanessa Lane was an acquaintance of Jeffrey Payne's, surprise, surprise, and Payne had bragged to Vanessa about molesting Jamie Vlasakis. And, with the contorted logic of a paedophile, Lane became jealous of that fact and resolved to tell Jamie's mother what was going on. Well, a couple of things, Jeffrey. What the f*** you doing telling people that you're, molesting people? That's fucking, great. I mean, do it, because then you'll get busted. But it's that seems a little bit insane. And Lane's also insane. What the fuck's going on? So on March the 3rd, 1994, Vanessa Lane and Robert Wagner showed up at Elizabeth Harvey's house and told her that Payne was abusing her son. Elizabeth called the police and Jeffrey Payne was arrested. Payne confessed to the crime. However, he was soon released on bail. How about we don't give bail to pedophiles who are abusing... What the fuck? And returned to his home across the street from Elizabeth Harvey's place while he awaited trial. Are you smoking crack, Australian justice system? Payne would sit on his front porch and yell filthy taunts at Elizabeth's sons, referring to them as, quote, my boys. He would also take photographs of them and declare that they were going to be used as masturbatory aids. Get that guy in fucking prison, lock him up, and throw away the key. Vanessa Lane found out about this and told John Bunting, the self-appointed local pedo slayer. Within the hour, Bunting came riding down the street on a motorbike armed with a .38 revolver. After introducing himself to Elizabeth Harvey, Bunting took Robert Wagner across the street so they could have a little talk with Jeffrey Payne. It's the first time I'm like, yes, Bunting, go! Bunting did most of the talking, issuing vicious threats, while Wagner stood behind him, obsequiously. David, it's a big word. I don't know what it means, David. Obsequiously, look up, obediently. Obediently nodding his head. There we go. That was easier, wasn't it? Payne accordingly stopped harassing Elizabeth's children. Nevertheless, John Bunting, Robert Wagner, Mark Hayden, and Vanessa Lane spent the next several days in Elizabeth Harvey's kitchen discussing how they could murder Payne to make an example of him. Their favourite strategy was to knock Payne unconscious, put him on a motorbike, and push him off a cliff, making it look like an accident. That is overly complicated. Elizabeth's ex-husband, Marcus Johnson, occasionally witnessed these discussions. He later wryly observed, quote, Vanessa Lane was present in a lot of these conversations, and I couldn't work out where she fitted in at any time, being on both sides of the fence, as it were. Despite all this talk, Jeffrey Payne was never harmed, possibly because Bunting knew that if Payne were to die in a suspicious accident or simply disappear, police would immediately consider Elizabeth Harvey and her new friends as suspects. Instead, Jeffrey Payne went on trial, was convicted, and was sentenced to 4 years in prison. That's not enough! He's sexually abusing children! 4 years? And he seems pleased with himself. He's sitting on the porch being all disgusting. How about we give him longer than that? Afterwards, Bunting, Wagner, Hayden and Lane continued to spend time in Elizabeth Harvey's kitchen, plotting revenge against other neighbourhood paedophiles, real or imagined. Bunting even took Elizabeth Harvey aside and warned her about Vanessa Lane. It was not long before the mentally unstable and emotionally vulnerable Elizabeth, who was 13 years older than Bunting, fell in love with him. They began a clandestine sexual relationship, despite the fact that Bunting was still married to Veronica. Additionally, Elizabeth's son, Jamie Vlasakis, now 14, took a shine to John Bunting, treating him as a father figure, and joined his little gang. For his part, Bunting convinced Jamie to stay in school and took him for bike rides and to the movies. Bunting also got Jamie to watch as he killed and skinned neighborhood cats and dogs, and even tried to cajole Jamie into shooting a dog in the face. When Jamie was unable to do so, Bunting did it himself. What the f***? It's what were you doing this afternoon, adopted dad? Not literally adopted, but you know what I mean. It's we're going to go for a bike ride, we're going to go to the movies, and then we're going to skin that dog alive. Bruh, what the fuck? So all in all, Bunting wasn't the greatest role model for an impressionable teenager. Yeah, no shit. The Wall of Spiders. The incident with Jeffrey Payne set a fire underneath John Bunting. The anti-pedo planning sessions became a weekly event being held every Friday night in Bunting's kitchen. It usually went like this. Vanessa Lane would denounce various people in the northern suburbs of Adelaide as predators, and then everybody would listen to Bunting rant for the better part of an hour about how disgusting they were. Then the conversation would turn to predators that they'd already quote-unquote researched. Bunting would rant some more, then he'd walk into one of the bedrooms and remove a yellow post-it note from a billboard that he called his wall of spiders. This was a motley patchwork of names, addresses, phone numbers, and photographs of real or imagined pedophiles, with scribbled summaries of their alleged crimes, connected by yarn to illustrate their connection to other suspects on the wall. It was the spitting image of the Charlie Day conspiracy meme from Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Yeah, is this actually something cops do? They use those little pins and they use their little ropes to tie everything together. I imagine they do it on computers nowadays, right? Having removed a post-it note containing the information about one of the accused predators from the wall of spiders, John Bunting would come back into the kitchen, call their home number, and start verbally abusing the person on the phone. The calls would always end with the threat of violence or outright murder. The recipients of these calls may well have been predators, but more often than not, they were mostly just gay, with no record of criminality whatsoever, with a few others being straight guys that Vanessa Lane accused at random to stay relevant and useful to Bunting. What the f*** is going on? When calling them on the phone wasn't enough, Bunting would lead the gang over to the houses of his targets and graffiti foul slurs on their fences and walls. Bunting might also damage their parked cars or sabotage the engines. In addition to the wall of spiders, Bunting kept small dossiers of information about the various targets in a file folder. Unbeknownst to Vanessa Lane, that included one about her. Quote, interests, hanging around toilet blocks, looking for young children, wearing pufter pants that show all his wares. Punching dung with everyone and everything, making a constant nuisance of himself, and flaunting the great side of his homosexuality if anyone is stupid enough to listen. Type of deviance, rock spider. Dobs in other rock spiders for the ego, denies that he is one. Known toucher of children, especially around the age of 12 to 14, would not torture victims but psychologically changes by playing power games. He believes that it is a form of love to do this to children. He has no conscience and cannot make up his/her mind if he is straight or gay, male or female. Takes hormones to create breasts and hormones to remove hair from its body. Quote ends. On August 16, 1994, the sun-bleached bones of Michael Tresize were discovered by two farmers in a sheep paddock near Lower Light. The remains had been unearthed from the shallow grave by foxes, scattered a distance of 50 meters and picked clean by birds. Tresize had been dead for 2 years. The farmers called the police, and 2 detectives from Adelaide's Major Crimes Branch arrived and cordoned off the area. Because there was no identification found with the bones, the coroner listed Tresize as John Doe and listed the cause of death as homicide by blunt force trauma. Police made a public appeal on the television asking anyone who had a male friend or family member between the ages of 15 and 20 go missing in the last 5 years to be in contact. Eventually, the police offered a $100,000 reward if someone could help identify the victim. Michael Tresize's family did not get in contact, and none of the resulting tips panned out. His body remained unidentified. But at some point it's going to be identified, right? Because obviously, we're sitting here in the future with our hindsight, and we know it's him. I'm wondering how this all comes falling down. I feel like there's just too many people involved in this. There's way too many people involved in your horrible crimes. At some point, someone's going to, roll over or get pinched by the police, and they're going to then roll over. Something's going to happen. By 1995, Elizabeth Harvey and her sons had practically moved into John Bunting's place, along with the boys' numerous friends who would show up, get drunk, or do drugs. The place was transformed into a mixture of a doss house and a crack den. No longer hiding his sexual relationship with Elizabeth Harvey, Bunting threw his wife Veronica out of the house. With the aid of her parents, Veronica filed for divorce. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Harvey, being hypersexual, once made the mistake of dating another man. Bunting threatened to kill Harvey, then found her boyfriend, put a revolver to his head, made him get on his knees and beg for his life. Bunting pulled the trigger. It clicked. There were no bullets in the gun, but the message was received. Elizabeth Harvey was John's and no one else's. Meanwhile, one of Bunting's cronies, Mark Hayden, had begun a relationship with a 33-year-old woman from Sydney named Verna Sinclair. Between 1978 and 1988, Sinclair travelled Australia, working mostly as a prostitute and having 7 children with 5 different men. Verna Sinclair dumped the first 3 kids into the childcare system, convinced her sisters to adopt the next 2, and kept the 2 youngest, William and Chris, with her on her travels. When Verna Sinclair first arrived in the northern suburbs of Adelaide in 1994, she was initially quite attracted to John Bunting, but when it became clear that he was involved with Elizabeth Harvey, Sinclair turned her attentions to Mark Hayden. Shortly after, they began dating. Verna and her 2 sons moved in with Mark, who still lived with his father, Edward, who had recently suffered a stroke. Edward had worked all his life in a car factory to buy that house. In 1995, while Mark, Verna and the boys were on vacation in Queensland, Edward was left at home with no food or ability to wash himself. He fell down the stairs and broke his hip. When Mark and Verna returned, They shoved Edward into an aged care facility, getting Edward's house to themselves. Frail and broken, in a bed in the old folks' home, Edward Hayden signed over the property deed to his son. Wow, son's really... dude. By 1995, John Bunting had completely poisoned Robert Wagner against Vanessa Lane. The now 40-year-old recalcitrant paedophile attempted, all too late, to get the 23-year-old Wagner to stop seeing John. But all this accomplished was more friction between Wagner and Lane. Their arguments frequently turned violent, exploding even in public. Robert's mother, Carol, recalled that on one occasion, she and Wagner were driving in the car when Vanessa Lane drove up behind them, rammed Carol's vehicle, and pushed them into oncoming traffic. Robert Wagner got out and started bashing and kicking the sides of Vanessa Lane's car. When Vanessa got out, Wagner started punching and kicking her in the middle of the street. When a Molotov cocktail was thrown at Wagner and Lane's house in retaliation for Lane harassing one of the local boys, the friction got even worse. Then, John Bunting told Elizabeth Harvey that he'd seen Vanessa Lane touching one of her sons. Whether this was a real allegation or a false one made by design, it worked in Bunting's favor. Elizabeth found Lane, punched him in the mouth, and then called Wagner to finish the job. He assaulted Lane, causing the latter to flee. Wagner, Bunting, and Harvey laughed at how Lane ran, calling it, quote, Barry's chicken faggot dance. Over the course of the next week, Wagner beat Lane every single day, often screaming, quote, "You bastard, you took me when I was 14. The police were called in and advised Vanessa Lane to move out and cease contact with Robert Wagner to avoid a dark result. Lane promptly fled and vanished into Adelaide's seedy underbelly. Unable to afford the rent on his Bingham Road house by himself, Robert Wagner briefly moved in with his mother Carol before moving into John Bunting's already overcrowded house at 203 Waterloo Corner Road. Wagner quickly started dating women in an effort to prove to Bunting that he wasn't gay. A few months later, Bunting, Wagner, Harvey, and Harvey's boys moved out to a farmhouse in Bacara, a rural township 175 kilometers east of Adelaide, with a whopping population of 20 people. This allowed an increasingly paranoid Bunting to conduct his operations against the men on the wall of spiders away from prying eyes. In order to retain his possession of 203 Waterloo Corner Road, but not have 2 rental properties listed under his name when he was supposedly on welfare, John Bunting telephoned his ex-wife Veronica and ordered her to move back into the Waterloo house. She obeyed without question. Jesus, he's got that hold, doesn't he? She's scared of him. Bunting signed over the lease to be in Veronica's name, but Bunting's friends continued to use 203 Waterloo as a doss house and a drug den, even with Bunting, Elizabeth Harvey, and Harvey's 4 children paying frequent visits and staying overnight. Thus, the intellectually disabled and easily manipulated Veronica Tripp remained Bunting's useful puppet. Elizabeth Harvey, meanwhile, informed her ex-husband, Marcus Johnson, there is a room available at 203 Waterloo. Marcus moved in without Veronica's consent. However, this turned out to be a blessing in disguise, as Marcus and Veronica soon developed a platonic rapport and began looking after one another. Neither of them, however, opposed Bunting's continued use of the property. Marcus Johnson once said of Bunting, quote, "He was not interested in sport. He had no hobbies. It just seemed as if the sun rose and the sun set on paedophilias, and that was virtually all he would discuss." I think he means pedophiles. It's noted here that it's incorrectly spelled. On October 26, 1995, over 3 years since the murder of Clinton Tresize, his mother Marilyn finally lodged a missing persons report. An investigation was conducted, and a photograph of Clinton Tresize was sent to the South African Forensic Science Centre for comparison to the cracked skull found in the sheep paddock at Lower Light in 1994. Unfortunately, the 2 forensic technicians working the case made a mistake. They concluded that Clinton Tresize's bone structure did not resemble the skull of the John Doe. This prevented a police investigation into Tresize's murder, along with the likely suspects Tresize was spending most of his time with in 1992. If the forensic techs had gotten it right, Bunting's gang probably would have been caught as a result. Instead, Tresize's skeleton went unidentified for a further 4 years. As a result of this error, many more people were going to die. Meet Suzanne Allen and Ray Davies. Susan Phyllis Martin was born in the town of Mildura in the state of Victoria on June 26, 1949. When she was 14, she left home to work at a sheep station in New South Wales. 20 years later, she had had 2 failed marriages and 4 children. The kids were all in custody of her ex-husbands and had very sporadic contact with her, maybe a visit every year or 2 and a card at Christmas. By the time she was 34, she changed her first name to Suzanne and retained her second ex-husband's surname, Allen. In 1983, she moved to Adelaide, went on welfare, and rented a house on Ghent Street in Salisbury North. When Suzanne Allen was in her early 30s, doctors diagnosed her with a series of maladies: obesity, asthma, heart disease, high blood pressure, carpal tunnel, and an intellectual disability. While living in Salisbury North, Suzanne was an avid attendee of nightclubs where she tried to find a new man. The 1980s were replete with Suzanne entering and exiting one toxic relationship after another. In 1989, when Suzanne was 40 years old, she met 20-year-old Ray Davies. In keeping with the theme of almost nobody in the story retaining their names, Ray Davies was born in June 1969 as James Leslie Davies. Dude, why is every... There's already enough characters in today's story that I've got to keep track of, and you've got to keep track of in your brain, and they're all changing their names, which is not making things easier. Both of his parents had intellectual disabilities, and they passed that on to their son. He was raised by an aunt. As a child, Davies dressed up in girls' clothes and played with dolls. When Davies was 13, his aunt caught him having sex with a dog. Bruh, dude. Oh, God. By the time Davies was 20, having arbitrarily changed his name to Ray, he had a criminal record for theft, assault, and yet more bestiality. In 1989, Ray Davies moved to Adelaide, living out of a motorhome and frequenting the city's gay nightclubs. Very quickly, Davies befriended Vanessa Lane and Robert Wagner. They offered to help Davies find a permanent place for his motorhome in Salisbury North. Suzanne Allen, ultimately, was their huckleberry, cheerfully agreeing to let Davies park his motorhome in her backyard. Suzanne, of course, had an ulterior motive. She was lonely, and very quickly she goaded the bisexual Davies into a relationship. He moved into Suzanne's house, with the motorhome still being kept in the backyard. Unbeknownst to Suzanne Allen, Davies still used it for sexual liaisons with men, and you guessed it, to occasionally have sex with dogs. What the fuck is going on with Australians in today's episode? Why is everyone a fucking weirdo? He also approached children on the street, and more than once his neighbors caught Davies masturbating in public. Due to Davies' mental disability, the neighbors cut in some slack, and more often than not, they just returned him home. Okay, so he's got to be fairly mentally disabled, right? For people to be like, that's okay, because he's not all there, right? He's pretty far gone, then, in my opinion. Like, he's having, sex with dogs and stuff, bro. Come on. Despite all of this, the relationship between Ray Davies and Suzanne Allen lasted for 4 years, with Davies committing several acts of domestic violence against Allen in 1990. Because of course he did, because that's another thing that's in today's episode, isn't it? Endless domestic violence. In 1993, they got engaged to be married. But then Suzanne got a report from one of the neighbors that Ray Davies had been hiding in the bushes and masturbating as some young girls walked past. Suzanne broke off the engagement, but due to the fact that Suzanne was intellectually disabled and lonely and perhaps not the best judge of things, she and Davies still remained friendly and let Davies live in the motorhome behind her house. As disgusting as the history of Ray Davies appears to be, it seems quite likely that he had a much worse mental impairment than doctors and social workers believed and really should have been institutionalized. Yeah, that's what I was kind of saying earlier. This guy seems like he needs proper help. Davies is less a care of malevolent sex predator than he is a severely mentally handicapped person who received inadequate treatment and was just left to run amok. For instance, when Elizabeth Harvey met Davies in 1994, she claimed she could not understand a word he said and, quote, he could barely string 4 words together. Meanwhile, in 1995, Suzanne Allen developed an infatuation with John Bunting. There are conflicting reports as to whether Bunting had sex with Allen at some point. Elizabeth Harvey didn't seem to think so, believing that the affections were entirely one-sided and that Bunting wouldn't take the 46-year-old obese, intellectually disabled woman seriously. On the other hand, Bunting regularly paid visit to Allen's house, though he usually brought Robert Wagner with him. Either way, Suzanne began writing Bunting love notes in which she called him her angle. Oh, it's supposed to be angel, but she doesn't know how to spell angel. David writes, he says, it's not a typo, this is what she says. And left little lipstick kisses on the paper. Until Bunting moved out to Becara, she drove past 203 Waterloo Corner Road every single day in her car. Oh no, Suzanne's being weird. Then, in early December 1995, Suzanne Allen stormed into her backyard, hammered on the door of the motorhome, and accused Ray Davies of molesting 2 boys that she knew. Whether this was true or not, we shall never know for certain. During the confrontation, Davies struck Allen in the face. She went to the police and got Davies slapped with a restraining order while police investigated her complaint. Davies moved his caravan elsewhere in Salisbury North. But Suzanne Allen also told John Bunting about her allegations. On December 25th, 1995, Bunting and Wagner ambushed Davies outside of his caravan and beat the living shit out of him. They then handcuffed Davies and forced him into the trunk of their car. Elizabeth Harvey and her children were staying with Veronica at 203 Waterloo Corner Road at the time. so the coast was clear for Bunting and Wagner to use the farmhouse at Betrayal to further torment Ray Davies. They drove the 2-hour journey out of Adelaide, stopping at a roadside restaurant for some lunch while Davies was in the boot of their car. Bunting and Wagner then frog-marched Davies into the farmhouse. They pushed him into the bathroom and forced him into the tub. There, Ray Davies was tortured for several hours, beaten, bludgeoned, burned, with a variety of insults and homophobic slurs being screamed in his ears. But worst of all, Bunting got a heavy metal pipe and smashed Davies countless times in the groin. Later, Bunting would brag that Davies' testicles had swollen to twice their normal size. But suddenly Bunting stopped. He didn't want to kill Davies yet. This was a shining moment in his campaign against local pedos. Bunting wanted to share it. Accordingly, Ray Davies was marched out of the farmhouse again and stuffed back in the car trunk. Bunting and Wagner then drove all the way back to Salisbury North, arriving at 203 Waterloo Corner Road. Bunting burst into the kitchen, where Elizabeth Harvey was sat, strung out on her usual dose of anti-anxiety meds, and declared, "I've got a present for you." It was Christmas after all. Numbly replied, "Well, bring it in then." Bunting and Wagner went to the car and dragged Ray Davies into the kitchen. Harvey later recalled, "He was obviously in a lot of pain. He was handcuffed. I couldn't think. They took him into the bathroom and started yelling and screaming at him, calling him a faggot and a baby rapist and things like that." Bunting and Wagner stripped Davies naked. They dragged him into the bedroom and made him look at the wall of spiders. Then they laid Davies on the mattress and commenced beating his groin with the metal pipe again. At some point during the assault, Jamie Vasakis and Marcus Johnson came to the front door of 203 Waterloo, but Elizabeth Harvey quickly told them to go away. She returned to the bedroom, where Davies was being tortured. Bunting asked Elizabeth, "Do you like your present then?" and ordered her to take part in the assault. Elizabeth Harvey grabbed a sharp ceramic garden tool and stabbed Davies multiple times in the leg. Then Harvey and Wagner retrieved a set of car jumper cables, wrapped them around Davies' neck, and strangled him to death. The trio of murderers dumped Ray Davies' body in the tunnel that Bunting and his friends had dug underneath 203 Waterloo, with Bunting joking that Davies was still cupping his balls as they threw him in. At the time, they didn't even bother to cover his body. When Jamie Vasakis came home, Bunting immediately told him about the murder and delighted in including the detail that his own mother had taken part. Jamie wasn't sure whether or not to believe the last part. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Harvey fell further into the benzos to cope with what she'd done, and in early 1996 she briefly committed herself to a mental institution. It was a full 6 months before Elizabeth Harvey dared to mention the murder to John, half hoping that it had just been some kind of terrible dream. John Bunting also told Suzanne Allen about the murder of Ray Davies, which, in these extremely contorted circumstances, only deepened her infatuation with him. What the f***? As far as Suzanne was concerned, Bunting was her knight in shining armor who had delivered her from a monster. Suzanne and Bunting were friendly throughout the first few months of 1996, with Bunting regularly visiting Suzanne's house. Again, it's unclear whether Bunting had a sexual relationship with her, but either way, he certainly enjoyed the hero-worshipping adulation. Meanwhile, John Bunting broke his rental contract on the farmhouse at Betrayal and moved Elizabeth and the 4 boys to a government-subsidised house on Lomond Street in the small town of Murray Bridge, 75 kilometres to the southeast of Adelaide. Nevertheless, Bunting retained 203 Waterloo as his secondary residence, where he frequently stayed with Veronica and Marcus on the lease. In May 1996, John Bunting started to get irritating with Suzanne Allen's constant love letters, surprise visits, and her cloying, fawning attentions. He began avoiding her, driving into his car and taking off whenever she arrived at 203 Waterloo, which was literally every time the Bunting was in town. But this avoidance only invigorated Suzanne's ardor. "Susan, get the message. Susan, it's not happening." The love letters got more frequent. "No, Susan!" Bunting constantly bitched to his neighbour, Robert Skews, that he couldn't take it anymore. So when Suzanne Allen's daughter Annette moved to Adelaide, Bunting took Annette aside and warned her that Suzanne had better back off, or there'd be consequences. Annette told her mother. In response, Suzanne hid inside her house for weeks, utterly heartbroken. Well, Suzanne, I gotta say, could he have been more clear? Suzanne, come on! But here was the problem for stopped offending Bunting. But yeah, Suzanne, get the message. But here was the problem for Bunting. He had told her about the of Ray Davies. Of course he had. Oh no! Nobody seemed to really care that the man had disappeared. He wasn't even reported as missing, but Suzanne Allen knew too much, and hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. Who knows what she might let slip. He's gonna murder her, isn't he? To better justify his homicidal intentions toward Allen, Bunting claimed that she stood by, ignored, and enabled Ray Davies' predatory activities for years. He labelled such women as tooth fairies. Then, in June 1996, Suzanne Allen simply disappeared. I wonder where she went. She went into a barrel. That's where she went, because Bunting murdered her. That's my prediction. Yeah, that big brain. Bunting and Wagner had shown up to her house one day, murdered her, dismembered her, and placed her 11 different body parts in trash bags and then dumped the bags in a tunnel under 203 Waterloo. Oh, in the tunnel. Of course, they were digging a tunnel. I forgot about that. So weird. What's the tunnel about? Nearby, the corpse of Ray Davies. Then, in October, after both Veronica and Marcus had moved out, Bunting and his cronies simply filled in the tunnel. Davies and Allen were entombed in several tons of dirt and brick a dozen feet underground. There are some unverified claims that after Bunting and Wagner disappeared, Allen, they briefly used her head as a football, laughing as they kicked it back and forth to each other. That's f***ing weird. Also, is that going to work? Like, heads are really heavy. Have you ever lifted someone's head up when they're just relaxing? Like, I don't want to get too morbid here, but kicking that head's going to really hurt. It's going to be like kicking a rock. Feels like I know something about kicking heads. I don't. But heads are heavy. You just think they're light because your neck's so powerful. Nobody knew where Suzanne Allen had gone. Her personal effects were still in the house, as were her unfed pets. She didn't even bother to say goodbye to her daughter Annette. A few days later, Suzanne Allen's car went missing, and then her house was ransacked with all the furniture being stolen. In reality, Bunting and his gang stole all of these things and then sold them off. If you've murdered someone, don't do smaller crimes around them that just increase your chances of getting detected. Why would you do that? It's not worth the $40 you're going to sell an old couch for. John Bunting and Robert Wagner began circulating rumours that Suzanne Allen had owed money to a couple of shady characters from downtown Adelaide and had gotten beaten up a few days before her disappearance. Later, Bunting claimed that Ray Davies was one of the thugs that had assaulted her, and then Bunting claimed that Suzanne had successfully got into hiding and was now living in the town of Gawler, 55 kilometres north of Adelaide. He added that Suzanne had met a young buck in his 20s and had gotten married. Admittedly, John Bunting was laying it on a little too thick and fast, not to arouse suspicion. Yeah, it's like, John... It feels very prepared, doesn't it, John? It seems like you really thought this through and came up with a really, in-depth background story about her disappearance, John. Weird, John. Suzanne Allen's brother, John, oh great, there's already enough characters in this, and now we got two bloody Johns, like good John and bad John, travelled to Adelaide in November 1996 in an effort to locate her. There he observed Allen's ransacked house and reported Suzanne missing. Police investigators found that Suzanne's bank account was still active, her disability payments were still being deposited in her account and then withdrawn like clockwork, a total of $17,000 since June. They were being withdrawn from a bank in Murray Bridge. In reality, Elizabeth Harvey had been impersonating Suzanne in order to collect the money. When police saw that Suzanne had changed her address to one on Lomond Street in Murray Bridge, they found the residence was leased to John Bunting. Oh my god. If police don't tie this together, it's like, what the f***? It's like, he couldn't be less careful. He's like, yeah, we murdered someone, we stole her couch, and now we're just taking money out of her bank account blatantly. When police interviewed Bunting about this, he claimed that Suzanne had stayed with him briefly in Murray Bridge before moving interstate to be with a new lover of hers, whom Bunting called Andy. Astonishingly, this cock-and-bull story was enough to satisfy the police, and they didn't pursue the disappearance of Suzanne Allen any further. No, police, come on! John Bunting, hardly a criminal mastermind, had once again gotten away with murder. Yeah, because the reality is often it's you got to be real criminal mastermind to get away with crimes. It's like, no, you don't. You don't even have to be careful, apparently. The last thing she heard was laughter. In 1997, Robert Wagner stopped speaking about Vanessa Lane entirely, and he would get violently angry if anyone dared to bring up the subject. Once, when someone mentioned Lane in conversation, Wagner lost it completely and punched a brick wall, shattering his fist and earning him a trip to the emergency room. Good lord. What is a shattered fist? Is that where many bones are broken? Oh, that's going to be hands are really complicated. There's all sorts of little bones in there, and the motions are so precise. that's going to be a recovery time. That's not going to be fun. Put simply, the decade Wagner had spent with Vanessa Lane just stood in such stark contrast to the hypermasculine, red-blooded heterosexuality that he now wanted to project, that he preferred to act as if the past 10 years had never happened. Wagner deliberately cultivated his interest in sports, guns, cars, and he even joined the volunteer fire department. It's compensating much, are you? It's like, did you just Google masculine activities? He also dated a string of women, the most recent of whom was 28-year-old Vicky Mills, a single mother of 3, originally from the Blue Mountains in New South Wales, who had done her time collecting bruises and horror stories in the shithole district of King's Cross in downtown Sydney. Vicky Mills soon fell pregnant with Wagner's own child, and the couple moved in together at 36 Mofflin Road in the North Adelaide suburb of Elizabeth. Vicky's 3 young kids quickly started to think of Wagner as their father. Vicky Mills had a cousin, 29-year-old Nicole Zarita, a single mother of 2 who owned a house in Salisbury North. Both women had fled from the wrong side of the tracks in Sydney in 1992, coming to Adelaide in search of a better life. Zarita had largely achieved that life, finding steady work and becoming a homeowner. In July 1997, Zarita took on a housemate, 19-year-old Michelle Gardner, a male-to-female transgender person. Gardner had a brother named Peter, whom Vicky Mills had once dated. Even after Vicky and Peter broke up, Michelle remained friend. Oh my god, there's so many characters. Just try to keep track of everybody. Gardner had a brother named Peter. So Gardner is the woman who is staying in this person who's the sister of the other person. Oh my god, David. Do we need all these characters? There's so many characters! Gardner had a brother named Peter, whom Vicky Mills had once dated. Even after Vicky and Peter broke up, Michelle remained a friend of the family, so it just made sense to have Michelle Gardner move in with Vicky's cousin, Nicole. I am utterly lost with these characters. There's like 8 people. It's like my brother's cousin's sister's pet. Like, what the f***? So it just made sense. Zarita also thought that Gardner was great with her 2 kids. In short, Nicole found Gardner to be the ideal housemate. All right, I'm just going to go with it and hope that this makes sense later because I'm lost with the characters. Given the times Michelle Gardner took the precaution of not going out in public dressed as a woman, she presented as a gay man and went by a birth name of Michael. But at home or with friends, Gardner dressed up in skirts, stockings, and a wig. She could not afford any surgeries or hormone treatments. Like many people in this story, Michelle Gardner had a rough childhood where her stepfather didn't approve of Michelle's sexuality and was entirely unsympathetic to her struggles with gender dysphoria. He was also verbally and physically abusive. Gardner's mother also did next to nothing to defend her child, and worse, when Michelle was 14, she was sexually assaulted by a friend of the family, and Child Services took one look at Michelle's home life and ordered the teenager into foster care. I mean, I know foster care's not brilliant, but her home life is really shit, so maybe that's a good decision. However, at the age of 19, despite all past difficulties, Michelle Gardner was out on her own and finally building a life for herself. So Michelle Gardner is a friend of the family of Vicky Mills, who's dating one of the main gang today. Okay. Okay. Unfortunately, Michelle Gardner's status as a housemate and friend of the family brought her constantly into contact with Robert Wagner, who loathed Gardner from the start. Okay, because Robert Wagner is... so she's... she's the housemate of Vicky Mills, who's dating Wagner, so Wagner's kind of up in her face all the time. By this point, John Bunting was firmly rooted in Wagner's head, and Wagner is pretending to be all masculine. And so he's seeing the situation, is probably not a giant fan of it, because it's basically just reminding him of himself. He took one look at Gardner and saw a gender-bending gay guy and thus a likely pedophile. And Michelle Gardner simply reminded Wagner a little too much of Vanessa Lane, who was actually a predator. One day in August 1997, Robert Wagner observed Michelle Gardner roughhousing with Vicky Mills' eldest son, and Gardner playfully put his hand over the boy's mouth to stop him from yelling. Wagner interpreted this move as sinister and flew into a rage. He let loose with a torrent of verbal abuse directed at Gardner, who quickly retreated back to Nicole Zarita's house. It was in that moment that Robert Wagner resolved to kill Gardner. Okay. There we go, he's going to kill someone else. Fine. Did we need 100 characters? On September the 6th, Nicole Zarita, who I've already forgotten who she is, left state with her kids. This left Michelle Gardner alone in the house. It was too good of an opportunity to pass up. Accordingly, Bunter and Wagner drove over to Zarita and Gardner's house in Salisbury North. Wagner used Vicky Mills' spare key to gain entry. The 2 men found and quickly subdued Michelle Gardner, handcuffing her and binding her feet. They kicked the shit out of Gardner for good measure. Then Bunting and Wagner ransacked the place, taking all of Gardner's stuff and stealing some of Nicole's furniture, her TV, some movies on VHS, and a vacuum cleaner. This was to make it look like Michelle Gardner had suddenly moved out and robbed Nicole on the way out of the door. Then Bunting and Wagner tortured Gardner, beating her and burning her with cigarettes until she wrote a note addressing Nicole, thanking Zarita for letting her stay there and promising to keep in touch. The letter also included an apology for stealing Nicole's stuff, which Michelle, writing under the duress, had done so to help pay for a sex change operation. In the chaos of the assault, and perhaps on purpose, Michelle dropped both the letter and the wallet underneath her bed to delay Zarita discovering the false story, perhaps so she'd contact the police. Bunting and Wagner drove Gardner to Murray Bridge. In May 1997, Bunting had moved from Lowen Street to 3 Burdekin Avenue. In the garden shed, they forced Gardner to call a friend and say that she was leaving town to sort out some personal problems. When the friend asked where Gardner was going, she replied that she was moving to Snowtown. After ending the call, Bunting and Wagner continued to beat Gardner mercilessly, burning him several more times with lit cigarettes and attaching jumper cables and a car battery to Gardner's genitals and electrocuting her. Then, Bunting and Wagner grabbed a rope and tied it around the victim's neck, attaching the other ends to a roof beam. They measured the length of the rope to be long enough that Gardner had to remain standing on her tiptoes. If she collapsed, she would hang herself. Once the rope was secured in place, the torture of Michelle Gardner continued. Bunting mocked Gardner, calling her, quote-unquote, the biggest homo, and adopting an effeminate camp sing-song voice when he said, "Oh, Michael, stand up. Stay on your feet, you naughty boy." Bunting thought the situation was hilarious and couldn't stop laughing. When Michelle Gardner could take no more, her legs buckled underneath her and she began to suffocate. Robert Wagner had adopted the nickname Papa Smurf because of how he made the victims turn blue when he strangled them, now grabbed the rope and tightened it around Gardner's neck. Bunting's laughter was likely the last thing Michelle Gardner heard before she lost consciousness and died. Bunting and Wagner went out and bought a large black barrel with a screw-top lid. They placed Gardner's whole body inside, headfirst, with the rope still around her neck. Her right leg was bent to fit inside the barrel, but there was not room to fully bend the victim's left leg, which resulted in it being partially extended, so they had to cut off Gardner's left foot in order to get the barrel lid closed. The foot has never been recovered. They dumped hydrochloric acid over the rest of Gardner's body in an attempt to dissolve it. Oh, right, and this was what we found at the beginning, that they're using the wrong type of acid. Once the barrel was sealed, Bunting and Wagner left it in the shed behind the house. Bunting would later tell the neighbors that the malodorous barrel was for compost. And when he later told 17-year-old Jamie Vlasakis about the murder of Michelle Gardner, Bunting, again, howled with laughter. I've forgotten who Jamie Vlasakis was already. Wasn't he oh God, I don't know. On September the 16th, 1997, Nicole Zarita returned home. Okay, so she's the homeowner that Michelle was staying with, who was like, again, I don't remember. It's too many characters. At this time, don't worry about it, dear audience. We'll be fine. Look, Bunting's murdering people in his facility who he has problems with. Jesus. At the time, Zarita did not find Gardner's concealed note, which had fallen along with Gardner's wallet under the bed in Gardner's room. Zarita had a hard time believing that the kind and gentle woman would just suddenly rob her and leave, but there were no signs of forced entry into the house, so ultimately Zarita concluded that Gardner must have robbed her after all. Nicole looked for Gardner all over Adelaide, hoping to find her and get her stuff back. A few days later, Robert Wagner and John Bunting visited Nicole Zarita and claimed that they'd seen Michelle Gardner at a petrol station talking to some gay men. Wagner claimed that they yelled at Gardner that she was quote-unquote a thieving poofter, and that Gardner had got in her car and drove away. Bunting and Wagner repeated this story to anybody who would listen. On September the 23rd, Nicole found Gardner's wallet and coerced note under the bed. Nicole concluded from the note that 19-year-old Gardner had fallen in with a rough crowd who were giving her bad advice. Nicole did not suspect foul play. Then, Vicky Mills called her cousin and told Nicole that Michelle Gardner had left a message on her answering machine requesting her wallet back. When Nicole went over to Mills's house to listen to the message, Mills claims that she had accidentally deleted it. All of this was shit, of course. Bunting and Wagner realized that the wallet wasn't in the pile of Gardner's stuff that they had stolen, and the wallet contained Gardner's ID, Centrelink card, and bank card, which Bunting and Wagner needed to withdraw Gardner's continuing welfare payments. A few days later, Nicole Zarita got a phone call from a man who claimed to be a friend of Gardner's saying that Michelle wanted her wallet back. Nicole replied, quote, "Yeah, and I want my stuff, so Michelle better come and see me." It's like, yeah, I'd like my wallet back. How about you give me all my shit back that you stole? Like, what the f***? The man phoned several more times. Eventually, someone impersonating Michelle Gardner phoned Nicole, asking if she should come and meet in the park to hand over the wallet. Nicole knew the person on the line wasn't Michelle and declined. In response, the person claiming to be Michelle said, "I just want to tell you, your kids taste nice." The f*** is that? A few days later, the fake Michelle called once again and told her, quote, "If you don't stop mucking me around, I'll have to come over and gut you myself." By this point, Nicole was worried that something nasty had befallen Michelle Gardner. Yeah, no shit. It's like someone's pretending to be her. You haven't seen her. She just disappeared. And they're wanting her wallet. It's like that is extremely suspicious. But Nicole did not report her missing, nor did Gardner's estranged family. Well, the family's estranged, so, I mean, not great, but you can see why they wouldn't report her missing. But Nicole, what the f***? This is really suspicious. Also, did you not report that someone had stolen all of your shit? And now, you might want to follow up with the police and be like, yeah, something weird's going on. Meanwhile, Bunting sent over Jamie Vlasakis to hang out with Nicole in order to spy on her and convince her to hand the wallet over. Vlasakis persuaded Nicole to give him the wallet and to break into a business during the night, steal some stuff, and leave Michelle's wallet behind. That way, the cops would be responsible for locating Michelle, and the wallet would no longer be in Nicole's hands, avoiding any more phone calls and threats. Of course, Jamie Vlasakis handed the wallet over to John Bunting, who began draining the welfare payments out of Gardner's account. Vlasakis, meanwhile, was the one who sold off Nicole's TV, furniture, and VHS tapes. Jamie used the money to fund his newly acquired heroin habits. It appeared that life with John Bunting as a father figure was taking its toll. Papa Smurf gets his revenge. In 1997, one of Bunting's thugs, Mark Hayden, married his girlfriend, Verna Sinclair, who, in keeping with the weird trend of this story, changed her first name to Elizabeth. Like her husband, Elizabeth... Guys, there's already enough characters! Stop changing your names! Like her husband, Elizabeth Hayden was well aware of the murders that were going on. In fact, Mark Hayden may well have participated alongside Bunting and Wagner in some of the murders so far recounted, allegedly, but this has never been verified. He was certainly a close friend of John Bunting's, who was often seen in his company, regularly partook in conversations about the men of Bunting's Wall of Spiders, and was later charged with 12 counts of murder, but 10 charges were dropped and 2 resulted in a hung jury, and Mark was only convicted of helping to dispose of the victims' bodies. On a completely unrelated note, my computer has developed some sort of malfunction where the words "do the math" randomly appear in all caps on the page, and for some reason I can't delete them. What a coincidence. It's like, yeah. You can figure out what's going on here, can't you? He had 12 things that he got off on. As for Elizabeth Hayden, she'll become very relevant quite soon. Okay, so Elizabeth Hayden was Verna Sinclair, who's Mark Hayden's, who's one of Bunting's thugs, who's allegedly involved. New wife, oh God. Meanwhile, Vanessa Lane had arrived back on the scene. Who's Vanessa? No, I'm just kidding. Vanessa's one of the main characters. In December 1996, Lane had been trying to turn over a new leaf. She repaired relations with her mother, Sylvia, by claiming to have found Jesus. She volunteered with the Salvation Army. There, Lane met single mother of 3, Michelle B. Hay, attending church together. There she met single mother of 3, Michelle B. Hay. Lane went by the name Barry, identified as a man, and told B. Hay that he was straight. They started attending church together. After a couple of weeks, Barry confided in Michelle B. Hay, a highly sanitized version of the past, that he quote-unquote had been a homosexual and that he used to dress up in women's clothing. He made no mention of his paedophilia. Barry Lane told Michelle B. Hay that he had accepted Jesus as his personal savior and was now a straight man looking for a wife. By January 1997, Barry and Michelle were talking about marriage, and by February they were engaged. They continued to live apart until the wedding. However, this didn't stop Barry Lane from committing several acts of domestic violence against Michelle. He once hit her so hard that he split both of her lips open. Once the Department of Families and Community Services got wind of the fact that Barry Lane, a convicted child predator with many more suspected cases of molestation in his file, was going to get married to a woman with 3 young kids, they immediately got in touch with Michelle B. Hay to warn her. Wow, look at that! Competence from the authorities, I like that! Yes! When it looked like B. Hay was going to marry Lane anyway, no, don't do that, for God's sake. They stipulated that until further notice, Lane could only have access to B. Hay's children in visits supervised by a welfare officer. Excellent choice. However, B. Hay and Lane quickly began to flout this order, with Lane coming over to B. Hay's house under the cover of night. B. Hay, you know they're doing this for your own good, right? And your kid's good. How about you think about that for just like a moment? He's a convicted child predator. B. Hay, get your shit together. But while Michelle B. Hay talked a lot about how Barry Lane had been cleansed of sin, from the moment she learned about Lane's convictions, their relationship slowly deteriorated. Yeah, look, I can understand how people who are very religious are like, oh yeah, no, they cured your gay. They cured your gayness and now you're a straight man. Boom, magic. Hail Jesus. But it's like, yo, he didn't mention that he was a child predator. And now you're like, oh yeah, no, I guess they cleansed that sin as well. I hope. Oh, God. Things worsened on April the 26th, 1997. Barry Lane invited a lodger into his house in the northern suburb of Hectorville, 18-year-old Thomas Trevelyan, a paranoid schizophrenic who often laboured under the delusion that he was a soldier in the Australian Army. He always wore army surplus fatigues or hunter's camouflage. Sometimes he claimed to be a sergeant, sometimes a lieutenant, sometimes a major. Trevelyan was prone to outbursts of violence and at one point slashed Barry Lane with a knife. Nevertheless, Lane kept him around because, in the boy's delusional state, Lane was often able to convince Trevelyan to have sex with him. Michelle B. Hay suspected that Barry was quote-unquote straying back into sex with men, which became abundantly clear when she discovered that Lane and Trevelyan shared a bed. The next line is going to be, Michelle decided to marry him anyway. Like, no, Michelle, stop! She broke off the engagement, excellent, but nevertheless maintained contact with Lane, being concerned for his general well-being and, of course, his immortal soul. Okay, Michelle, you do you, but at least you broke off the engagement. When John Bunting got wind of Barry Lane's latest activities. He was disgusted. Bunting now considered Lane to be at the center of the web on the wall of spiders. He wasn't an informant, he was a ringleader, previously sacrificing a few pawns to John Bunting while he continued his own predations unscathed. Bunting also hadn't forgiven Lane for blabbing about the murder of Clinton Tresize to his then-wife Veronica. Lane might still tell someone else and land Bunting in prison. It's kind of amazing that John Bunting is not in prison, given how many people he's told about his murders, and who have then told other people about the murders. Like, how? Get your shit together, police. Thus, John Bunting knew that Lane's murder was long overdue. Robert Wagner likewise wanted Barry/Vanessa Lane dead. As far as Wagner was concerned, Lane had ruined his life by grooming him into a lover at a young age and then violating him for nearly a decade. And now, Lane was doing the same thing to yet another vulnerable teenager. And indeed, it was clear to everyone in the neighborhood that Trevelyan didn't consent to being touched by Barry Lane, and he often publicly resisted the 42-year-old's attempted caresses. But Trevelyan didn't have the mental clarity to get out of that damned house and away from Barry Lane. However, Bunting and Wagner secretly got in touch with Trevelyan and encouraged the teenager to seek his emancipation. Accordingly, the two older men laid out a hideous plan. This is just like... So these two pieces of shit are going to go and do something about this other piece of shit. It's like... I don't like anybody. On night of October the 17th, 1997, John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and allegedly another accomplice from Salisbury North, whose name was subsequently suppressed by court order, lit out for Hectorville. The 2 or 3 perpetrators were let into Barry Lane's house by Thomas Trevelyan. Bunting and Wagner subdued Lane, handcuffed him, dragged him into the bedroom, and forced him onto the mattress. They shoved a rolled-up surgical bandage into Lane's mouth to muffle his screams and held it in place by wrapping several layers of packing tape around his head. For the next several hours, they tortured Barry Lane, hitting him in the face, stomach, and testicles, and taking a pair of heavy pliers and crushing Lane's toes one by one. Thomas Trevelyan was ordered to participate in Lane's torture, which he readily did. Yeah, but Thomas Trevelyan is not mentally competent. He's a paranoid schizophrenic who thinks he's in the army, and this dude's been abusing him. I don't hold that too much against him. Like, this is just crazy. After Barry Lane passed out from the pain, Bunting and Wagner relented and removed the tape and bandage. They slapped Lane several times in the face to revive him. They demanded Lane's bank card and PIN number, which Lane quickly surrendered. They then retrieved the telephone from beside the bedside table. They forced Lane to call his mother Sylvia in Port Pirie, to insult her, call her a whore, and say that she wasn't his mother and wanted nothing to do with the family, and that he was moving to Queensland. After a few minutes of this, Bunting hung up the phone. Sylvia thought she could hear Thomas Trevelyan's voice in the background. Sylvia immediately got on the phone to her other son, Cyril, and asked him to drive over to Hectorville to check on Barry. Good move. You should have called the police to check on Barry, to be fair. But that's better than nothing. Cyril was willing to go until he realised that his car didn't have enough petrol in the tank for the journey. Barry was on his own. I get the feeling like Cyril might have made more of an effort. Maybe his mother should have been more, urgent about it. Next, Thomas Trevelyan telephoned Michelle Behe and told her that he and Barry had gone to the Clare Valley wine region for a few days' vacation. However, he said that the car had broken down, so they'd been delayed returning. Then Barry Lane was put on the phone and he said, quote, "I love you and I love the kids," before asking Behe to collect his mail and feed his dogs. The line suddenly went dead. Michelle Behe could have sworn that there was something strange about Lane's voice. It sounded strained, anxious. Then Bunting took out a tape recorder and forced Lane to say a few phrases into it that Bunting could use on the telephone after Lane was dead. With that, the bandage was stuffed back into the victim's mouth and secured again by tape. The rest of his toes were crushed. Then Robert Wagner came in to administer the coup de grace by strangling his former lover with his bare hands. Wagner crowed about his nickname, Papa Smurf, and jokingly said to Bunting, "First they go blue, then they go poo," the last part referring to the phenomenon of dead people relaxing and voiding their bowels. Yes, I got that, David. Like Michelle Gardner, Barry Lane died to the sounds of John Bunting laughing, jeering, and mocking him. The victim's corpse was then rolled up in a carpet and left in the hallway, with Bunting and Wagner lazily and carelessly deciding to come back in a few days to dispose of it. After they left, Thomas Trevelyan went to sleep in the same bed that had just murdered someone in. The next day, Trevelyan went to stay at Robert Wagner's house. Wagner's girlfriend, Vicky Mills, was immediately creeped out by the leering young man pointlessly dressed in camouflage. What is this guy doing? Just get out of there. I know he's not there. He's not mentally there, so we can't. It's just like, dude, you've made some errors. This is not a good place to be. A few hours after Trevelyan departed for Wagner's house, Michelle Behe showed up to collect Lane's mail and feed his dogs. On the way out of the door, Michelle stepped over a roll of carpet that, little did she know, concealed the body of Barry Lane. Oh my lord, these guys are so careless. That's nuts. 2 days after the murder, Barry's sister Crystal, who lived in Queensland, received a phone call. It was from Barry, and it was odd to say the least. After Crystal said hello, Barry immediately began talking, and he ignored all of Crystal's attempts to interrupt. Barry said that he'd been in Queensland for a few days, either by bus or hitchhiking, and then the line went dead before Crystal could respond. Of course, this was the recording that Barry had been forced to make before Robert Papa Smurf Wagner had murdered him. That's creepy. Like, in my mind, I was kind of like, I'm not sure what they're using the recording for, but it's definitely I was like, it's either to access his bank or something, to be like, yes, I'd like to make a withdrawal or something like that, because they like stealing the money from the things, or to make someone think that he was alive even after he was dead to throw the police off the timeline. On October the 21st, 4 days after Lane's murder, Bunting and Wagner went back to Lane's house and retrieved the carpet concealing the body. They tossed the roll into the trunk of their car and drove out to 3 Bedurkin Avenue in Murray Bridge. In the shed, the black plastic barrel was at the ready. This time, the killers had to be much more economical about space to fit Lane's body on top of Gardner's. They fully dismembered Lane's corpse into several small pieces. The arms and legs were pulverized at the joints, the hands and feet were cut off, the shoulder blades were likewise detached from the torso. Oh, the rib cage and look, enough. They dismantle his body, essentially. I don't need to read that. On October the 27th, Michelle Behe reported Lane missing. She also related to the police the strange, incoherent story Lane had told her about the murder of Clinton Tresize. But in 1997, Tresize's body had not been identified, and Lane was known to police to tell some erratic and fanciful stories. Additionally, the phone call made by Barry to his mother on the 17th and supposedly made to his sister on the 19th led police to conclude that this time Lane had simply left the state. Tying up loose ends. Robert Wagner attempted to turn Thomas Trevelyan into his protege, seeing in the younger man a version of himself. He even signed Trevelyan up for the volunteer firefighters, but the 18-year-old wasn't all there, to put it mildly, making it difficult for Wagner to preach neo-Nazi ideology or John Bunting's rabid, foam-flecked theories about gays and child molesters. It didn't help that Trevelyan frequently thought he was a soldier, living in army barracks. The boy was off his meds. Whenever Trevelyan heard a suspicious noise outside, he ran out the front door wielding a kitchen knife. If that went enough, he sometimes literally wore a tinfoil hat to block out the mind-controlling signals of enemy satellites. This guy is not there. Like, what's going to happen to him? Because he's getting involved in all of this stuff. He was involved in a murder, but he doesn't have the mental capacity to, realize what he's doing, does he? On October the 30th, 1997, Thomas Trevelyan paid a visit to his cousin, Lenore Penner, and confessed to the murder of Barry Lane, adding that the older man had sexually abused him. Trevelyan was quite accurate about the torture methods employed, the fact that they'd extracted Lane's bank details and that they had placed 2 phone calls to Lane's relatives. But Trevelyan neglected to identify the names of the other men who acted as his accomplices. Trevelyan added that he was afraid that these men were now going to kill him to keep things quiet. Yes, you should be afraid, because they've done that before and they'll do it again. Lenore concluded that this outlandish story was just another of Trevelyan's delusions. Yeah, but again, not unreasonably so, and asked her cousin if he'd been taking his medication. Trevelyan replied angrily that he had not. Shortly afterward, he left. On November the 4th, 1997, less than 3 weeks after the murder of Barry Lane, Vicky Mills emerged from her house to discover Thomas Trevelyan holding a knife and chasing a 9-year-old daughter around a parked car. The girl cradled a puppy in her arms, and Trevelyan was threatening to cut its throat. Vicky screamed for Trevelyan to stop. He shouted back, "It's just a mutt. It doesn't deserve to live." A neighbor passing by saw the commotion and yelled out to Vicky, asking if she should take the puppy. Vicky replied, "Yes, for God's sake, take it." The neighbor bravely grabbed the animal and treated some distance down the street from Thomas Trevelyan, who soon gave up and went back into the house. A few hours later, Robert Wagner returned home and told Vicky what had happened to him. His expression did not change. She merely muttered, "I'll talk to him." Wagner went to the phone and called John Bunting, who turned up at the house soon after. It's also alleged by some people that another man also turned up to Wagner's house to assist with wrangling a knife-wielding paranoid schizophrenic. The 2 or 3 men announced that they were going to take Thomas Trevelyan for a little car ride. They forced the teenager into the trunk of Bunting's vehicle and drove 25 kilometers east into the countryside, stopping at a patch of woodland called Humbug Scrub, just on the outskirts of the town of Kersbrook. Wagner and Bunting and whoever else marched Trevelyan at gunpoint down a roadside embankment. They arrived at the base of a nearby gum tree. They tied a thick rope around Trevelyan's neck and made him stand on a red milk crate, while they attached the other end to a thick tree branch. At that point, an elderly couple pulled up behind Bunting's vehicle on the country road and peered down the embankment. Due to the angle, what are you doing? You shouldn't be doing murders where people could just stumble upon you. Due to the angle and the poor vision, they could not see Trevelyan standing precariously on the milk crate on the other side of the tree with a hangman's noose around his neck. The old man asked John Bunting if he could be of any assistance. Bunting smiled and replied that everything was fine. Once the elderly couple drove away, Bunting turned around and said, "That was close," and immediately kicked the milk crate out from under Trevelyan's feet. His neck did not break, and his feet did the hanged man's jig for nearly 3 minutes as he suffocated. The next day, November the 5th, a passing truck driver spotted Thomas Trevelyan hanging from a tree in Humbug Scrub. After a brief investigation, police ruled that it was a suicide. After all, Trevelyan, suffering mental illness all his life, had first tried to hang himself as a Boy Scout meeting when he was 11 years old. At age 14, he tried 2 more times, first with a gun and then with a rope. At age 17, while institutionalized in an Adelaide mental hospital, his attending psychiatrist concluded that another attempt was highly likely. So far as the relevant authorities were concerned, Trevelyan's death was a tragic but seemingly inevitable outcome. Thomas's cousin, Lenore Penner, initially believed that Trevelyan's story about Barry Lane was some sort of delusion brought on by a psychotic episode, but after Lenore heard about her cousin's death at Humbug Scrub, suddenly she wasn't so sure. Lenore went to the police and told them the story that Trevelyan had related to her about the murder of Lane and also his concerns that his unnamed accomplices might try to kill him. Yeah, even if someone's crazy and they come to you, it's like someone's trying to kill me, and then they die suspiciously very soon after, be like, that's interesting. Maybe I should consider what's that about, you know? Police took no notice of Penner's testimony and assured her that Barry Lane was alive and well, residing in Queensland. Has anyone seen Gavin? Gavin Allen Porter was born in the state of Victoria in December 1967. Gavin's parents got divorced when he was an infant. His mother got custody, but she fell into a chronic depression, so Gavin was raised by his grandmother. Gavin's childhood was relatively peaceful, and when he graduated school, he tried to be a telecommunications technician. This landed him a fairly lucrative blue-collar job both in Australia and the Philippines. Okay, it's a bit of a commute, isn't it? However, in 1991, at the age of 23, Porter developed a heroin addiction, and he began walking the tightrope between his career and his crippling habit. Then, in 1992, Gavin's mother died of cancer, sending him into a tailspin. In 1993, he briefly took a job in the opal mining town of Mintabi in South Australia, before moving to Adelaide and fully surrendering to his addiction. At first, Gavin slept in a hostel, and then, with increasing regularity, he slept in doss houses and on the street. In December 1994, Gavin was admitted to a methadone program to help kick his addiction, but it wasn't long before Gavin was back on heroin. In the summer of 1997, Gavin went back on methadone in a second attempt to quit. It's during this time that 29-year-old Gavin Porter met 17-year-old Jamie Vlasakis, who, despite his young age, was already a heroin addict and also trying to kick the stuff. They became friends, but fed off each other's cravings, and soon enough, both of them were back on the skag. Between the two of them, they were spending $400 to $600 a day on heroin. That's crazy. What is that? That's like $18,000 a month. That's an insane habit. Even if you're doing crime, that's a lot of money to get your hands on. In order to finance the habit, they committed house burglaries, acted as drug couriers, and trafficked sex workers interstate. Whenever the money dried up, Gavin and Jamie would go back on methadone to fill the gap. At the time, Jamie was still living in Murray Bridge with his mother, Elizabeth Harvey, his brothers, Adrian and Christoph Lasakis, his half-brother, Trey Yude, and of course his father figure, John Bunting. In January 1998, Jamie invited Gavin to move into 3 Bergdon Avenue with him. Little did Jamie know, he'd just signed Gavin Porter's death warrant. Gavin spent his days shooting up, passing out, and tinkering with his car. Elizabeth Harvey liked Gavin, but she often rolled her eyes and shook her head when Gavin was found passed out around the house. And he could literally be anywhere. Once Elizabeth found Gavin passed out while he was bent over and still standing under the propped hood of his car, face down on the engine. When Gavin woke up, he walked into the house with the outline of the engine imprinted on his face. John Bunting, meanwhile, was irritated by Gavin Porter. Not long after the addict moved in, Bunting stepped on one of his syringes in the bathroom. Oh, bro. That's one of those... Ugh. Elizabeth Harvey managed to calm Bunting down, and she warned Gavin to cut down on his heroin use to avoid John's wrath. Gavin Porter lasted 3 months in the house. On April 3rd, he visited a methadone doctor to renew his prescription. This was not another attempt to get off the dope. It was to create a cocktail of methadone, benzos, and heroin that was more cost-effective to shoot into his arm than simply burning through his costly supply of heroin. On April the 5th or 6th, John Bunting sat down on an old couch in his garden shed next to a rather sinister-looking black barrel that stunk to high heaven. Suddenly, he felt a prick in his arm. Another goddamn syringe. Bunting again flew into a rage and decided he was going to murder Gavin Porter. I mean, He's got stuck with 2 syringes. That's insane. In order to justify the killing in his head, Bunting added drug dealers to his list of societal enemies like gays and child predators, and the female quote-unquote tooth fairies who enabled them. Bunting conveniently overlooked the fact that his would-be protege, Jamie Vlasakis, was also a heroin addict. On April the 7th, or the 8th, 1998, John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and possibly one other accomplice, who shall not be named, found Gavin Porter passed out on the backseat of his car parked on Bunting's driveway. Elizabeth Harvey was inside the house. Jamie had taken his brothers to the cinema. Stealthily, Robert Wagner slid a noose over Porter's head and around his neck without waking him. Then Wagner pulled the rope tight and started to strangle the victim. Porter awoke with a struggle. Bunting climbed in the back seat and attempted to hold Porter down. The victim grabbed a screwdriver from the car floor and stabbed Bunting in the hand with it, but it was no use. Gavin Porter passed out. Wagner kept up the pressure and soon the victim was dead. Elizabeth Harvey, a few feet away from the kitchen, didn't hear a thing. Bunting, Wagner, and possibly a third perpetrator, allegedly, carried Porter's body into the garden shed. They then got on the phone and ordered themselves Chinese takeout. Oh no, I don't like it when it's like they do these horrible things and then it's just like, yeah, they just carry on with their life because they're pieces of shit without proper emotions. Ugh. Jamie arrived home with his younger brothers a few hours later. He walked into the house, said hello to his mother, then froze when he saw Bunting and Wagner sat together on the couch. Lately, the presence of Papa Smurf usually portended something bad. Bunting and Wagner took Jamie to the garden shed and gestured to a pile of bedsheets and old couch cushions in the corner. Bunting triumphantly removed them to reveal the body of Jamie's friend Gavin Porter. The next thing Jamie recalled was going temporarily deaf. He knew that Bunting was talking to him, but he couldn't hear a word. After that, the next sensation Jamie remembered was feeling a sense of fear at the way Bunting was looking at him. Then Bunting walked over to a black barrel in the corner and unscrewed the lid. A burst of rot was launched into the air and filled the shed. Bunting ordered Jamie to look inside the barrel, where he saw the body of Michelle Gardner and the dismembered and defleshed remains of Barry, aka Vanessa Lane. Jamie turned around and was violently sick on the floor. Bunting and Wagner looked at the corpse, taking Porter's ID and bank card. There had been no need to torture Porter for his PIN number before killing him. The addict had already revealed it to Bunting a few days earlier when he was strung out on heroin. Wagner took Porter's car and drove back to Adelaide, where he parked it in front of his house. Vicky Mills came outside and said, "That's Gavin's car." "No, it isn't," Wagner said abruptly. Vicky Mills shrugged her shoulders and went back inside. 2 days later, John Bunting pulled up to 3 Burdekin Avenue and ordered Jamie Vlasakis to get the new black barrel he'd just purchased out of the back of the car. They brought it into the garden shed. Jamie helped Bunting put the body of Gavin Porter headfirst into the new barrel. They did not bother to dismember it. And unlike the body of Michelle Gardner, they managed to get it to fit without cutting anything off. Then Bunting poured a few gallons of hydrochloric acid on the corpse and sealed the barrel shut. He walked over to the other barrel in the shed, opened it, looked at the remains of Gardner and Lane, and then remarked, quote, "They're rotting nicely." If Bunting had used a different kind of acid, these 2 bodies would have long since liquefied and could have been poured down a drain. Instead, Bunting had incompetently saddled himself with 2 heavy containers full of bones and corroded flesh. Bunting resealed the lid. Then he and Jamie carried the barrel containing the body of Gavin Porter to his vehicle, whereupon they transported it to the Adelaide suburb of Elizabeth, and to spread joy and blame, it was stored at Robert Wagner's house. As a reward for his assistance, Bunting gave Jamie his friend's bank card and told him the PIN number. This was by design. Bunting was slowly implicating his would-be protege in his crimes. Yeah, Jamie, you are getting set up, mate. Soon, Jamie wouldn't have a choice but to participate more actively. Jamie took Porter's welfare deposits and shot the money into his arm. John Bunting and his gang prepared the lie that Gavin Porter had moved back to Victoria, but no one reported him missing. He was a junkie. The world did not seem to care. Fratricide. One evening, in July 1998, John Bunting and Elizabeth Harvey were watching television when an episode of Australia's Most Wanted came on. It was an episode devoted to cold cases, and they briefly mentioned the skeleton police had found in 1994 in the rural township of Lower Light. Detective Trevor Couch issued an appeal for information leading to the John Doe's identity. Quote, "I think it's really sad that nobody knows who this young man was or how important it is that we find out. We've been throughout Australia with missing persons records. We've talked to Interpol. We've worked with the Department of Immigration to look at people who've overstayed their visas." John Bunting turned to Elizabeth Harvey and grinned, "That's my handiwork." John Bunting, what the f***? On another evening that summer, Bunting got into an argument with Elizabeth's eldest son, Trey Yode, now 22 and still living at home. Bunting and Troy were arguing over LGBT rights. Bunting predictably declared that they should all be killed. Troy disagreed, saying, quote, "They're harmless if they keep to themselves. I don't give a shit." Yes, it's like that. I feel like that should be the standard position. It's like, why do you care? Like, advocate, don't advocate, whatever. But it's like the standard position should be, who cares? Just let people do what they want. It's not a crime. Bunting asserted that most gays were kiddly fiddlers. Well, that is a crime, and I don't think that's true. Troy denied this was true. Troy coming at him with facts. Bunting got up, left the room, and slammed the door. Little did Troy Yode know, his half-brother Jamie Vlasakis had told Bunting that Troy had molested him when Jamie was 13 and Troy was 16. Wait, is that true though? Jamie had endured an extremely traumatic life. His father, Spyros Vlasakis, also sexually abused both Jamie and Troy for years until Spyros dropped dead when Jamie was 6 and Troy was 9. Bunting never really liked Troy Yode. He was rebellious, disrespectful, prone to fits of temper and melancholy, and often came home drunk or stoned. He had no time for Bunting's wall of spiders or his neo-Nazi ramblings. Their argument over homosexuality, combined with the knowledge that Troy had abused his half-brother, gave Bunting all the pretext he needed to murder his girlfriend's son. John Bunting contrived an excuse to get Elizabeth Harvey and her youngest sons, Adrian and Christopher, out of the house. He convinced Elizabeth to take a trip to visit one of her friends in southern Adelaide and spend several nights there. Then, in the middle of the night, sometime between August the 25th and September the 8th, being strung out on heroin, Jamie Vlasakis could not remember the exact date, Bunting and Wagner entered Jamie's room and woke him up. Some accounts of this event, including Jamie's, explicitly claim that a third man was also there. The 2 or 3 older men were armed with wooden furniture legs, which they intended to use as makeshift bludgeons, otherwise known in Australia as waddies. Wait, Australians have a specific name for using furniture legs as a weapon? Imagine you go to Australia to people carrying around furniture legs. Bunting handed Jamie a waddy and a pair of handcuffs. The men then snuck into the adjoining bedroom where Troy was fast asleep. They silently surrounded Troy's bed on all sides. Suddenly, John Bunting gave the signal, shouting, "Now." All 3 men started bludgeoning Troy Yode in the head and chest. Troy woke up screaming. He jumped onto the bed, then leapt to the corner of the bedroom, his back against the wall. He asked, "What's happening? What are you doing?" Bunting and Wagner charged at him, continuing to beat him with their large wooden clubs. Bunting screamed at Troy to lay down on the floor. He complied. Bunting yelled at Jamie to put the handcuffs on his brother. Jamie did so, but then felt so overwhelmed that he had to leave the room. A few moments later, Bunting and Wagner dragged bleeding Troy out of the bedroom and into the bathroom. Jamie followed them in and watched them force Troy into the bathtub. They took a Stanley knife and cut off Troy's t-shirt and pajama pants. Then Bunting and Wagner laid into him with their waddies again. Troy started to weep uncontrollably. Bunting took out a tape recorder and turned it on. It recorded Troy screaming and begging for mercy as Bunting and Wagner continued to bludgeon him. Then the beating stopped for a moment. Bunting commanded Troy to call him Lord Sir and to call Wagner God. He ordered Troy to call the third man, who may or may not have been there, allegedly, Chief Inspector. I'm very curious about this third man who's involved in all of this stuff, because we're going through this episode and obviously we've got a lot of details, which I'm assuming came from court and witness testimony later from one of these people who are there. And does this mean that the third person, who seems to come up a lot in this episode, gets away with this? Then Bunting told Troy to choose a nickname for Jamie, who stood petrified at the bathroom door. Troy called him Moses. Bunting screamed, "That's a Jew's name," and the beating commenced again. Afterward, Troy made a second attempt and called Jamie Master. Then Bunting and Wagner started crushing Troy's toes with heavy pliers, torturing the young man into saying a total of 20 phrases into the tape recorder. These included, quote, "Mum, I can't handle it in this house no more. It's all around me. I'm going to see the earth before there's none left. Wish me luck." And "You're going to stay the f*** out of my life." Then Bunting forced Troy to tell him his PIN number and commanded him to apologize to Jamie for molesting him. Troy wept as he apologized. Then Bunting started reciting the names of people he'd already killed, at one point turning to Wagner and asking, "Have I left anyone out?" That's you recording your crimes. Bunting, you are just... You're a terrible criminal. In both ways. Wagner grinned and tied a rope around Troy's neck. For the next several minutes, Wagner kept relaxing and increasing the pressure, dragging out the agony of Troy's execution. Jamie couldn't stand it. He grabbed the end of the rope and pulled it hard to kill his brother, but the rope snapped. Wagner retied the rope around Troy's neck and the torture continued. At that moment, there came a knock on the front door. Bunting got up to see who it was. It was some of Troy's friends. They smiled and asked Bunting if Troy was home and if he'd like to come out. Bunting replied that Troy wasn't there and slammed the door in their faces. Bunting returned to the bathroom just in time to see Troy die. Then Bunting ordered Jamie to kick his half-brother in the head. Jamie complied. Then Wagner jumped on the victim's chest, breaking some of his ribs. The perpetrators wrapped Troy's body in several garbage bags and carried him out to the shed. As they entered the shed, the stench of corpses rotting there for several months made Jamie double over and start to dry heave. The putrid odor did not seem to bother the other men. After dumping the body on the floor, the men got into a car and drove to McDonald's for a late-night meal. Jamie was not able to eat and just watched as the other men stuffed their faces with burgers and fries. The next morning, Elizabeth Harvey returned to 3 Burdekin Avenue in Murray Bridge. Bunting told her that Troy and he had had an argument and that the younger man had stormed off out of the house. Elizabeth's reaction to this upsetting news was to go and run herself a warm bath that her son had just died in. Oh my fucking God. That's so f***ed up. 2 days after the murder, Bunting and Wagner purchased another black barrel and brought it into the garden shed. They made Jamie watch as they do horrible things to him, to his body, that I'm not going to read. That's too much. According to Jamie's later testimony, a third man, who will not be named, stood outside the shed, saying that the sight of the dissection was too gruesome for him. Ooh, I have a theory. Is the third man the guy who turns on all of them and testifies? And is David just leaving it a mystery because he went into, witness protection or whatever? The remains were thrown in the barrel and soaked with hydrochloric acid. In Bunting's shed, there were now 2 barrels containing Michelle Gardner, Barry Lane, and Troy Yude, with the third that contained Gavin Porter being at Wagner's house. As another reward, Bunting gave Jamie his brother's bank card, just like he had with his friend Gavin Porter. Jamie withdrew Troy's welfare deposits to spend on heroin. Jamie later testified about how his relationship with Bunting changed after the killing. Quote, "Afterwards, he said it was my first murder and everything like that. Asked how I felt about it. Things like that, And I just agreed with him. Said to him that I enjoyed it. I didn't. But I kept the lie going because, I thought, well, if he can do that to my brother, he could do that to me. You're goddamn right he could. If you said anything, if you looked like you were going to turn on him and weren't in his club, he would kill you because that's what he does in this situation. But now you've killed someone, so you can't go to the cops." A few weeks after the murder, John Bunting told Elizabeth that he ran into Troy in Adelaide and that he'd gotten a job and a girlfriend. Bunting had not yet made use of the recorded phrases taken from Troy on the night of the murder to feign that it departed for good. Elizabeth wondered why Troy would not contact her. She wrote Troy a letter and handed it to Bunting and asked him to deliver it next time that he saw him. Bunting immediately threw it in the trash. These tape recordings and stuff, it's like, now this is so much scarier. Because there's all these tools now where it's like you can upload a few seconds of someone's voice onto the internet and then you just type it in and it sounds like the person's saying it. And it's not perfect, but it's pretty fucking good. And it's going to be perfect before long. And then it's not just going to be typing. It's going to be you can just speak into a microphone or whatever, and an app or AI or whatever will change your voice into that person's voice. So this is going to be a whole lot easier for criminals to fake this kind of stuff, which is real scary. Incomprehensible madness. Shortly after Troy's murder in early September 1998, John Bunting, Elizabeth Harvey, and her remaining 3 sons moved down the street to a new government-subsidized house at 26 Burdekin Avenue in Murray Bridge. The new house did not have a shed that could properly store the 2 stinking barrels. Obviously, Bunting could not leave them behind at number 3 Burdekin for a property agent from the housing trust or the new tenants to discover. Yes, that would be bad, although John Bunting is very sloppy and open with his crime, so maybe it's the sort of thing he'd just be like, "I'll be fine." But even he's not that stupid. And so Bunting arranged for his other henchman, Mark Hayden, whose name has been conspicuously absent for a while, to take the 2 barrels. He stored them in his garage. This conveniently got all the evidence of the murders off Bunting's own property. Robert Wagner, recognizing the advantage of this, soon got Hayden to take his barrel as well. Mark Hayden, you fucking patsy. In early 1998, sold his father's house in Salisbury North and bought a new place at 4 Blackham Crescent in the Adelaide suburb of Smithfield Plains. He lived there with his wife Elizabeth and her 2 youngest sons, Will and Chris. In May 1998, they were joined at Blackham Crescent by Elizabeth Hayden's sister, Jodie Elliott, and her 17-year-old son, Frederick Robert Brooks. More people! Oh God. Frederick Brooks was born on March 7, 1981. His parents had met at a Centrelink welfare office in Sydney. When Fred was a toddler, his parents separated and Jodi Elliott dumped him into the government childcare system. Fred spent the majority of his childhood growing up in a series of foster homes. When Fred was 15, childcare agents tracked down his father, Frederick Brooks Sr., in Queensland and asked if he would give his son a home. Brooks Sr. agreed. Brooks Sr. agreed. Not long after, Jodi Elliott arrived on the scene and rekindled her relationship with Brooks Sr. They were all one big happy family. The arrangement lasted less than 2 years when the relationship allegedly became abusive and Jodi Elliott fled Queensland with her son to live with her sister Elizabeth Hayden in Adelaide, South Australia. Jodi and Fred Sr. shared cramped quarters in what had previously been a children's playroom in the back of the house. Jodi collected welfare payments because she was unable to work due to severe mental illness, and despite his age, Fred collected a small income from the government because he was registered as his mother's caregiver. Fred Brooks attended high school and applied to join the Australian Air Force Cadets in order to forge a better life for himself. Yeah, I like that. Like, the military feels like a good way out. I don't know. It's like the military's obviously got its own issues and stuff, doesn't it? But you often see these in this situation where it's like, yeah, you join the military. And I mean, we often hear about where it went terribly wrong because otherwise it wouldn't be an episode, would it? But I imagine there's lots of people in shitty situations who go to join the military, get some skills, and then leave the military after a stint and hopefully not super f***ed up from war, and then hopefully lead a better life. Within a few days of Jodi and Fred's arrival at Blackham Crescent in May 1998, they were introduced to John Bunting. Jodi immediately became infatuated with Bunting and they began a sexual relationship. Conversely, Bunting immediately took a dislike to Fred Brooks, who was intellectually slow. Combined with the fact that Brooks was related to Mark Hayden's wife Elizabeth, whom Bunting thought was quote-unquote a fat whore, Bunting concluded that Fred Brooks had inferior genes. Bunting conveniently ignored the fact that he was now sleeping with a woman from the same gene pool. As for Bunting's erstwhile live-in girlfriend, Elizabeth Harvey, apologies for all the Elizabeths, oh my god, David, that's the least of... There's Elizabeth, there's Johns, there's 1,000 characters. She was none the wiser about Bunting's affair with Jodi Elliott. Oh, okay. So Bunting's basically... So Jodi she moved with her son, Fred Jr., to some new place where she meets Bunting, and Bunting and her have an affair. Elizabeth, who is Bunting's live-in girlfriend, doesn't realise about this affair. Bunting doesn't like the woman he's having an affair with, son, because he's slow. Okay, sort of there. However, after the disappearance of her son Troy in September 1998, Harvey was made uneasy by Bunting's increasingly sinister, erratic and macabre behaviour. Oh right, he already murdered one of his girlfriend's child, right? So, okay. Harvey drove her 17-year-old son Adrian from Murray Bridge to Adelaide and moved him in with a friend of his named Marcus. What? Okay. Elizabeth Harvey wanted Adrian out of the way from all the mayhem that she suspected might be around the corner. Meanwhile, her youngest son, Christopher, was only 13 at the time and had to stay with her, and Bunting had his claws too far into 18-year-old Jamie for her to get him out of the house and remove him from danger. Meanwhile, things were accelerating. Approximately 2 weeks after the murder of Troy Yude, Bunting, Wagner and Jamie were hanging out at Mark Hayden's house watching TV. Fred Brooks was also there. At one point, Fred got up, lost his balance, and instinctively grabbed Jamie's leg to keep him from falling over. Bunting took notice of this accidental touch, and his contorted mind soon became convinced that the move was deliberate. To give you an idea of how messed up Bunting was at this point, I don't think we need any idea. We know how messed up he is, David. He's a f***ing psycho. And try and follow this logic, 17-year-old Fred Brooks touched 18-year-old Jamie Vlasakis on the leg. So Bunting went home that night and started ranting about how Fred Brooks was a paedophile and a homosexual, and he probably also had been out, quote-unquote, touching up young girls. What the f***? Ergo, Bunting concluded, Fred Brooks had to die. Sounds like you're just looking for an excuse to kill Fred Brooks. Bunting, doesn't it? In truth, Bunting's febrile mind just grasped for any excuse, however flimsy, to commit murder. Exactly. On September the 17th, 1998, less than 3 weeks after the murder of Troy Yude, Fred Brooks received notification that had been accepted into the Air Force Cadets. He told his mother, Jodi Elliott, that he was going out with his friends that night to celebrate in the town of Victor Harbour, 80 kilometres south of Adelaide. It's a hell of a journey. He was going to, quote, get lucky, get pissed, and get laid. That evening, as he was leaving to go to the party, Fred Brooks got talking to Bunting, Wagner, and possibly a third man outside of Mark Hayden's house. Bunting convinced Brooks to ditch the party and go with them instead to break into an electronics store that night. Bunting told Brooks that if he participated, he'd be given a brand new computer and a share of the cash from any of the goods they sold. Brooks accepted. Fred Brooks is slow. Fred Brooks, this is a mistake. It's a mistake even if it's the truth, because you just got into the Air Force Cadets. Your life is potentially going to change for the better somehow. You're managing to get out, and this is not gonna be good. The men travelled to 26 Burdekin Avenue in Murray Bridge to supposedly pick up equipment they needed for the burglary. When they arrived, Bunting found Jamie Vlasakis outside, fully absorbed by tinkering with his car in the garage. Bunting instructed Jamie to come inside, where there was quote-unquote a surprise waiting. Bunting added vaguely that no matter what, Jamie should play along. Jamie walked into 26 Burdekin to find Fred Brooks there, apparently under the impression they were going to rob a computer store. Bunting brought out a pair of handcuffs and a pair of thumb cuffs, which bind the hands together by the thumbs, and that they should play a little game first. Bunting cuffed Jamie and handed him the key, telling him to try and free himself. Jamie managed to do this. Then Bunting put the handcuffs and thumb cuffs on Fred Brooks, but he did not hand Brooks the key. As an aside, Bunting was inspired by a similar trick that John Wayne Gacy and before him Dean Corll used to restrain some of their unsuspecting victims. Similarly, Bunting's use of barrels was inspired by the body disposal methods of Jeffrey Dahmer. There is some irony to this copycat behaviour. Bunting was a homophobe who said he wanted to murder child predators, but all three of the aforementioned serial killers were homosexuals who were sometimes known to prey on underage boys. After Fred Brooks was cuffed, Robert Wagner put him in a headlock and constricted the victim's throat with his arm. After suffocating Brooks for nearly a minute, Bunting barked an order, quote, "Let him go, or you'll kill him." According to Jamie Vlasakis, Bunting told Brooks to be a good boy, not to scream, not to physically resist. Then Bunting, Wagner, and possibly a third man pushed Brooks into the bathroom and forced him into the tub. Bunting ordered Brooks to refer to him as Lord Sir, Wagner as God, Jamie as Master, and another man in the room as Chief Inspector. They then used a Stanley knife to strip off the victim's clothes. Bunting turned on the tape recorder. They beat Brooks savagely, focusing their blows particularly on the victim's groin. They compelled Brooks to say a series of phrases into the tape recorder, addressed to his mother and aunt, alternating between friendly and hostile, that would give Jodie Elliott and Elizabeth Hayden the impression that Brooks had run away to Perth with a girl. Then Bunting forced Brooks to share his banking information and his PIN number. The unrelenting sadism that Fred Brooks suffered that night was worse than anything the previous victims had suffered. I will briefly summarize it here. They torture him. I don't need to read this, David. This is way too far, and that's not what I want this show to be. They torture him horribly, basically. Worse than before. That says something. The perpetrators dumped the victim's body in the trunk of an old car in John Bunting's backyard. Then, Bunting ate a meal, took a shower, and drove to Mark Hayden's place, where he had sex with the victim's mother, Jodie Elliott. It's just fucking super psychopathic. You guys don't know what I just read. And I'm not going to explain it further, but it just makes it even more fucked up. Don't look it up. You don't want that. Trust me. The next day, she became nervous that her son had not yet returned from the party in Victor Harbor. At 8 p.m. that evening, Jodie called the police and reported Fred Brooks missing. 2 days later, I'm sorry, did I say that he was murdered? They tortured him and then obviously they killed him at the end. So that's that. 2 days later, on September the 19th, Bunting and Hayden told her that they'd seen Brooks in downtown Adelaide, blackout drunk and acting aggressively. Jodie called Brooks' mobile phone and heard the voice of Fred Brooks telling her to, quote, "F*** off and leave me the fuck alone." On September the 21st, Mark Hayden towed the old car to his house, pulled Brooks' corpse out of the trunk, and dumped it on the floor of his garage. 3 days later, on September the 24th, Bunting and Wagner bought a fourth black barrel, transported it to Hayden's garage, and disposed of Fred Brooks' body like they did with Gardner, Lane, Porter, and Yude. On September the 26th, Elizabeth Hayden got a call on the landline at 4 Blackham Crescent. She heard the voice of her nephew, Fred Brooks, verbally abusing her and saying that he had no intention of returning. After consulting with Jodie Elliott, Elizabeth Hayden called the police and told them that Fred Brooks was no longer missing. He had simply run away. The police classified Fred Brooks' missing persons file as no longer active. Due to the fact that Brooks had supposedly run away, his caregiver's pension was cut off. He also had a youth training allowance from Centrelink, but it wasn't a lot. And so at the end of September, John Bunting and Jamie Vlasakis went to a doctor's office where Bunting claimed his name was Gavin Porter, one of the victims who had not been reported missing, and Jamie Vlasakis impersonated Fred Brooks. After being coached by Bunting, Vlasakis successfully mimicked the symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia and was given a medical certificate. They took the certificate to Centrelink to apply for a disability pension for the fake Fred Brooks and a caregiver's pension for the fake Gavin Porter. The social worker at Centrelink cut off Brooks' training allowance and made a second appointment to question the fake Fred Brooks in 2 weeks' time to make sure that the story was genuine. In mid-October, Bunting and Vlasakis returned to the Centrelink office and passed the examination. They listed the address as 36 Moffin Road, the address of Robert Wagner. Thus, they successfully scammed a disability and caregiver pension. Finally, Bunting completed a form to get both payments deposited into Gavin Porter's bank account, which they had access to. Meanwhile, John Bunting had already set his eyes on another victim. Within a few days of scamming Centrelink, and only 6 weeks after the murder of Fred Brooks, he would strike. Lonely and vulnerable. Gary O'Dwyer was born in Adelaide in late 1969 and abandoned by his parents. He wound up in the childcare system, where in 1971, at 18 months old, he was taken by foster parents Maureen and Dalmain Fox. Being unable to have kids, the couple had already fostered 9 other children. Thus, Gary O'Dwyer grew up in an idyllic farm just outside of Adelaide with 6 foster siblings who were still kids. He was closest to his sisters, Debbie and Denise. In 1974, Dalmain Fox died of a heart attack, but Maureen continued to raise her brood of children. She had a particular soft spot for Gary, who was always very small for his age, partly owing to severe malnutrition when he was a baby. In 1984, at the age of 15, Gary O'Dwyer left the farm and became a juvenile delinquent, sleeping rough on the streets of Adelaide. In order to survive, O'Dwyer committed several petty thefts and burglaries. When he got caught by the police, he always admitted what he had done. He didn't see much point in lying, and so the years passed with it looking like Gary O'Dwyer would become just another transient. However, on the night of December the 25th, 1994, Gary was hit by a car while he was walking along the highway south of Adelaide. The 25-year-old was knocked unconscious and badly injured. The driver who hit him sped away. Gary was discovered by a truck driver the following morning. He spent a week in a coma. A multitude of steel plates were used to cobble together his fractured skull and his mangled left leg. When Gary awoke, he underwent 6 months of rehab, during which time it became clear that he had suffered severe brain damage, which crippled his capacity for abstract thinking and mathematics. He walked with a permanent limp. This is so scary. Like, I think about this sometimes, and it's like getting in an accident, which affects your brain and just affects how you think and, like, all your emotions or whatever like that. It's, like, really scary. Because that can happen, and then it just turns you from you into, like, less capable you. The hit-and-run driver was tracked down, criminally charged, and was also forced to pay out a massive financial settlement. Well, good. How about no hit-and-run, Which Gary used to rent himself a place in the town of Murray Bridge. Gary also went on disability pension. As a result of the brain damage, Gary O'Dwyer found it difficult to relate to other people and had no friends whatsoever, but his foster mother, Maureen, kept in constant touch with him. Gary also had dreams of meeting a girl, getting married and having children, but he never had any romantic prospects. Thus, Gary led a lonely, friendless existence. He fell into drinking and heavy drug use. His brain injury also resulted in him having severe fits of temper, which also formed a barrier to friendships. Yeah, I don't know, like I brought that up previously. Like, it made him a bit slower with the maths and abstract thinking and stuff, but it often leads to, like, increased aggression or, like, fits of temper, right? Which is also scary. I wouldn't like to have that. It's like, it's not me, and it's not him. It's just the thing changes you. Gary was not only lonely, but trusting, multiple times giving a key to his house to total strangers, only to come home and discover that they'd robbed him. In truth, Gary probably should not have been living alone, since he was extremely vulnerable to anyone who might wish to exploit or harm him. Yeah, he needs care. Like, he's clearly had a severe brain injury, and he needs what's it called, like a caretaker, or the person who legally makes sure that you're doing all right. In late October 1997, John Bunting first laid eyes on Gary O'Dwyer, limping as he crossed the street. Bunting asked Jamie Vlasakis, who was with him at the time, "Who is that fag?" Jamie replied that he didn't know. After this initial sighting, Bunting noticed Gary quite a lot over the course of the next year. Gary didn't drive, so he was frequently out walking in Murray Bridge. Bunting would always remark on him whenever he saw him, always calling him a homophobic slur. Not that Bunting knew the first thing about Gary O'Dwyer, though. In the autumn of 1998, Bunting pointed him out to Jamie Vlasakis again, saying, quote, "Look at that fag. You know, he looks so much like Troy." Bunting had recently murdered Troy Ude, so it's an understatement to say that this comment set Jamie on edge. Much to his dismay, Bunting ordered Jamie to get to know O'Dwyer, in particular to find out if he had any close relatives and whether he received any welfare payments. Jamie accordingly paid a visit to his friends Steve and Kim, who lived next door to Gary. Jamie lingered outside their house and leapt on the opportunity to talk to O'Dwyer over the fence when he spotted him. Lonely and trusting as always, Gary eagerly answered all of Jamie's questions. On October the 26th, 1998, just 5 weeks after the murder of Fred Brooks, Gary's foster mother, Maureen, saw him walking down Swanport Road in Murray Bridge. Gary was carrying his groceries home. At the time, Maureen was in a car, driving in the opposite direction and couldn't stop to talk to him. That was the last time she saw Gary O'Dwyer alive. Elsewhere in Murray Bridge, Jamie Vlasakis was driving in his car when he saw John Bunting's vehicle behind him, honking his horn and flashing his lights. Jamie pulled over. He could make out Bunting behind the wheel and Wagner in the passenger seat. Bunting approached Jamie's window and asked the younger man what his plans were for the evening. Jamie replied that he was going to a party with friends. Bunting told him to put it off. He had something for him to do. Bunting ordered Jamie to go to Gary O'Dwyer's house and tell him that a couple of blokes wanted to meet him. Gary was overjoyed with this prospect. Around 8 p.m, John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and possibly a third man showed up at Gary's house. Jamie Vlasakis introduced them. Then the men got to chatting and drinking for about 10 to 15 minutes. John Bunting stayed completely sober, but actively encouraged the others to get pissed. Jamie recalled, quote, "I was just sitting there, pretty quiet, because I knew what was going to happen. John turned to me and said, 'Well, I've got to get Gary a bit pissed,' and asked me to scull a few drinks with Gary." A bottle of 60% alcohol Mississippi moonshine was brought forth, and Bunting filled 2 tumbler glasses to the brim. Both Gary and Jamie guzzled the booze down, while Bunting, Wagner, and possibly a third man chanted "skull, skull, skull." So I guess this means like drink, drink, drink. Some Australian slang. Bear in mind that Gary O'Dwyer was 5'4" and 110 pounds. Even though Gary was an experienced drinker, this amount of alcohol hit him hard. Then, without warning, Wagner came up behind Gary and put him in a headlock, choking him out. This caused Gary to have a seizure. Just like in the murder of Fred Brooks, Bunting shouted at Wagner, "Let him go, or you'll kill him." Gary fell to the floor and continued to seize. Once he'd recovered, he asked, "What's going on? What are you doing? What's this for?" John Bunting told him to shut up and only speak when spoken to. Jamie was instructed to address Bunting as Lord Sir, Wagner as God, Jamie as Master, and another man in the room as Chief Inspector. Later, Gary actually uttered the last of these grandiose titles on tape, making it abundantly clear that someone else was there that night. I'll give you 3 guesses, but you only need 1. Wait. Is everyone else in the audience being like, I know who? Who is it? Gary was cuffed and dragged into the kitchen. He was forced to sit down on a mattress where the mentally impaired young man usually slept. Jamie recalled that Gary was shaking from head to toe and did not attempt to resist his assailants. The tape recorder was turned on and Gary was beaten until he admitted that he was both gay and a child predator, but Gary O'Dwyer was neither. Yeah, this is why torture isn't particularly effective, because it elicits false confessions, because people just want the torture to stop. Jamie Vlasakis took part in the beating to, quote, "reassure Bunting that I was still playing, still doing what he was doing. I was still with him that way, that I wasn't a threat to him. To assure that I wasn't murdered." Bunting then ordered Vlasakis to go out to the car and get the torture equipment, including things that make sense to you if I had read the details of the torture of the last person, which I'm not going to do, and I'm not going to mention what these things are, but just know that they are grim. Gary O'Dwyer would ultimately suffer the same torture as those endured by Fred Brooks. I listed those horrors previously, I didn't read them, and there's no need to revisit them here. In the middle of all of this sadism, at around 9 p.m, Jamie Vlasakis told Bunting that he couldn't stay any longer because he was due at the party and his friends would come looking for him. In reality, of course, Jamie couldn't bear to watch the torture any longer. Bunting accepted his excuse and Jamie left, chugging several bottles of beer and nearly crashing his car on the way to the party. The tape recording of the murder bears witness to the rest of the tortures. When Gary O'Dwyer finally died, he was dumped in the laundry room and the killers left. The next day, Bunting, Wagner, and Vlasakis returned to loot O'Dwyer's house. Because the neighbors Kim and Steve might spot and recognize Jamie Vlasakis, Bunting had a plan. The 3 men knocked on Kim and Steve's door and claimed that Gary O'Dwyer had moved to Sydney because there were some shady characters from Adelaide threatening to beat him up or kill him. Brandishing Gary's house key, Bunting explained that O'Dwyer had sold him all of his furniture for $200 or $373 in modern money. To further add credibility to the deception, Bunting told Kim and Steve to come into the house with him and take any furniture that Bunting didn't want. While they were in the house, Kim observed that something smelled rotten. Bunting laughed and said that Gary had taken some meat out of the fridge and put it in the sink in the laundry room. Naturally, Kim and Steve were not allowed to go in the laundry room, where the body of Gary O'Dwyer was already starting to rapidly decay in the heat of the insipid Australian summer. 3 days later, Bunting and Wagner returned to the house and transported the victim's body to Mark Hayden's garage, where it was dismembered and placed in the black barrel containing Fred Brooks. Gary was the Bunting gang's 10th victim, and the 6th to be disposed of in this way. He had been selected at random and was murdered so Bunting could collect his disability benefits. He wasn't a pedophile. He wasn't gay. All that confusion was just window dressing for a murder motivated by greed, and also to satiate Bunting and Wagner's ever-mounting sadism. Gary's foster mother, Maureen Fox, did not report him missing because, quote, "I didn't want to be seen as the interfering mother and considered that Gary was capable of looking after himself and would contact me in his own due time. I never thought anything sinister had happened to Gary. 1,000,000 tears have been shed since I learned of my son's death. There will, more than likely, be millions more. But will the ache inside of me ever stop? I doubt it." Months later, Gary's sister Denise travelled to Sydney in an effort to find her brother, but to no avail. Pouring petrol on a dumpster fire. John Bunting had always hated Mark Hayden's wife, Elizabeth. He hated that she'd previously worked as a prostitute. He hated that she had abandoned 5 out of her 7 kids. He hated that she was £250. He hated that she had cheated on her previous husbands and suspected she was doing the same to Mark. Robert Wagner felt similarly about Elizabeth Hayden. She was a, quote, "f***ing lowlife and a fat whore." Even Mark Hayden himself was sick to death of his wife, her tantrums, her nagging, her morbid obesity, and her hard-nosed attitude. But even in John Bunting's gang, none of this was a capital offence. None of this fell under the umbrella of paedophilia, homosexuality, or being an enabling tooth fairy. Well, does that matter, Bunting, anymore? Because you just killed a random mentally disabled dude who was none of these things, just because you wanted his f***ing disability money. But then came the straw that broke the camel's back. Mark Hayden reported to John Bunting that Elizabeth not only knew about the most recent Barrel murders, but Mark had told her about the 1992 murder of Clinton Tresize. The cops had his body and were still trying to identify it. If they did, that would immediately lead the police in Bunting and Wagner's direction. So, to John Bunting, the justification for the murder of Elizabeth Hayden was clear. She knew too much, and of course, as a sweetener, he could kill her and collect her welfare money. The first thing was to get her kids, Will and Chris, out of the way. On Friday, November the 20th, 1998, Mark and Elizabeth dropped them off at the house of her brother, Gerion Sinclair. In recent years, Gerion had moved to Adelaide to be near his 2 sisters, as did their mother. Gerion was taking the boys for the whole weekend. In itself, that wasn't unusual. Elizabeth frequently dumped her 2 youngest kids on friends and relatives so she could go off drinking or simply not have to deal with them for a few days. That night, Mark took Elizabeth out to a restaurant. Given that, when someone is murdered, the prime suspect is always the spouse until they're ruled out, the next thing was to give Mark Hayden an alibi. They also needed to get Elizabeth's sister, Jodie Elliott, who was living in the playroom of number 4 Blackham Crescent, out of the house for the evening. Accordingly, at sunset on Saturday, November the 21st, Mark Hayden drove Jodie Elliott 50 kilometers to the southern Adelaide suburb of Rainella. Ostensibly, this was to take Jodie to look at a chihuahua that she could potentially mate with her own dog. Okay, John Bunting had given Jodie the tip, but the chihuahua and its owner did not exist, and Mark took his sweet time waiting for this non-existent person to show up before slowly driving back to his house in Smithfield Plains. Meanwhile, back in Blackham Crescent, Bunting and Wagner attacked Elizabeth Hayden while she was alone in the house. At first, she thought the ambush was a joke. Then she thought that Bunting and Wagner were going to rape her. She told Bunting that if he wanted sex, he only needed to ask for it. But it soon dawned on Elizabeth that the situation was much more severe. They slapped her in cuffs and pushed her into the bathroom, forcing her into the tub, as had become their standard MO. She was brutally beaten. Then Bunting turned on the tape recorder. Like the other victims, Elizabeth Hayden was tortured into saying a variety of phrases to use over the phone. Then a sock was stuffed in her mouth and secured with a layer of tape around her head. She was then tortured much like the previous victims. Then Robert Wagner tied a noose around her neck and strangled her to death. Wagner insisted on this, claiming he enjoyed delivering the coup de grace. Bunting and Wagner wrapped the corpse in garbage bags and dragged Elizabeth Hayden's body out of the garage where a newly purchased 5th Black Barrel awaited her. However, due to her body weight, it was rough going, and the killers just dumped Hayden on the floor of the garage before going back to the house to have a rest. They'd try to get her into the barrel later. Meanwhile, Mark Hayden and Jodie Elliott had pulled over at a petrol station on Port Wakefield Road, and Mark ran into the station saying he'd phone ahead to let Elizabeth know they were not far away. But when Mark came back to the car, he said to Jodie, quote, "All hell's broken loose at home." John Bunting met them outside of 4 Blackham Crescent and claimed that Elizabeth Hayden had tried to kiss him, and when Bunting rejected her, she had gone to her bedroom to sulk. Bunting then volunteered to take Jodie to get some takeaway. When they returned, Mark Hayden claimed that his wife had gone off in a huff with one of her quote-unquote boyfriends. According to one source, when Mark Hayden went into the garage and saw his wife's body, he allegedly laughed, but I've not been able to corroborate this with other sources. On Sunday, November the 22nd, Mark Hayden told Jodie that Elizabeth had come home drunk at the crack of dawn, grabbed some things, and then took off with her boyfriend for good. Jodie bought this story. After all, it wouldn't be the first time that Elizabeth had just run out on a husband with another man and simply disappeared. Jodie also reasoned that her sister probably wouldn't try to contact her because she lived in the same house as Mark. That evening, Mark swung by Gary and Sinclair's house to pick up Elizabeth's two sons, Will and Chris. Mark Hayden told Garion that Elizabeth was at home asleep. The children were distressed to return home and find that their mother wasn't there. The following day, Monday the 23rd, Will and Chris walked from school to Gary and Sinclair's house and told him that their mother was missing. This contradicted what Hayden had claimed the night before. Garion asked Mark what was going on. Mark repeated the lie, that on Sunday night, Elizabeth had run away with a boyfriend and wasn't coming back. Hayden added that his wife had also cleared out her bank account along with the account of his father, Edward. Garion told Mark to report Elizabeth missing. Mark refused. Elizabeth wasn't missing. She was just an unfaithful, thieving whore. On the night of Tuesday, the 24th of November, Gary and Sinclair swung by 4 Blackham Crescent to see if Elizabeth had returned. She hadn't. By then, she'd been shoved in a black barrel, specifically reserved for her, with a noose still around her neck and the sock still taped inside her mouth. Bunting and Wagner did not attempt to dismember the body. The next morning, November the 25th, Gary and Sinclair went to the police himself and filled out a missing persons report for Elizabeth Hayden. Garyon's suspicions were further increased when, upon returning to 4 Blackham Crescent, Mark had changed his story, saying that Elizabeth had accused him of having sex with her sister Jodie, and that Mark had gone out to visit his father, Edward, in the old folks' home, only to return home and find Elizabeth had gone. Later that morning, Elizabeth Hayden's friend, Sharon Ball, had grown concerned at Elizabeth's mobile phone and called Elizabeth's mobile phone. John Bunting was prepared for this. After a brief pause, Sharon heard Elizabeth's voice. "Leave me alone. I'm all right." Then the line went dead. After sitting in stunned silence for a few minutes, Sharon Ball phoned her friend's mobile again. There was another pause. Then Elizabeth's voice said, "You're a slut. You're nothing but a dirty f***ing slut." And then the line went dead again. Sharon tried Elizabeth's mobile a third time, but after the call was picked up, Sharon just heard a man's voice say, before hanging up. Meanwhile, John Bunting circulated a rumor that Elizabeth Hayden had abandoned her husband and children, like she had done several times before, and gone back into prostitution. He even went so far as to say that somebody had seen her working a street corner in King's Cross in Sydney. What is perhaps surprising is just how many people in the northern suburbs of Adelaide bought the story. Mark also paid a visit to Elizabeth's mother, who in 1997 had moved to Adelaide to be near her 3 adult children. According to her, Mark just sat in the living room for 5 minutes without uttering a single solitary syllable. He was not able to look her in the eye. Suddenly Mark said, "She's gone." Then without another word, Mark Hayden got up and left. The bloodhounds descend. Ooh, finally we're getting caught. That's going to be nice. It's been a f***ing while, hasn't it, police? On the evening of November the 26th, 1998, the missing persons report for Elizabeth Hayden hit the desk of Detective Greg Stone. He'd just started his late shift and cracked open the file folder. One thing immediately struck the detective as odd. Elizabeth Hayden had been reported missing by her brother, Garion, yet Elizabeth had a husband, and she lived with him. Why didn't he report her missing? Detective Stone smelt a vague whiff of foul play, and Mark Hayden immediately became a prime suspect in his wife's disappearance. Not a person of interest, a suspect. Although it was nearly 11 o'clock at night, Stone got in his car and drove to Blackham Crescent and knocked on Mark Hayden's door. After a brief introduction, during which the suspect expressed some surprise and discomfort, Stone asked Hayden and his sister-in-law, Jodie Elliott, to come out onto the station and answer a few questions. At 11 at night? Bro's dedicated. I don't want to laugh at that, though. It's really good, but I'd be kind of, bothered, especially if I was innocent. Rather than guilty, be like, you need to come down to the station. It's 11 at night! Come back in the morning! Once at the police station, Mark Hayden was questioned and wrote a page-and-a-half testimony riddled with errors due to his semi-literacy that claimed that he had taken Jodie out for a drive, come home, and found out that Elizabeth had made a pass at John Bunting. Then, while Jodie and Bunting went to grab some takeout, Elizabeth stormed out of the house, declaring that she was going to stay with her boyfriend. Mark claimed that Robert Wagner had been there and witnessed the whole thing. Hayden testified that the next night, at 4 a.m., Elizabeth staggered in drunk, took her things, and ran off with her boyfriend seemingly for good. Jodie Elliott was taken into a separate interrogation room, and her story matched Hayden's. After giving statements, Hayden and Elliott departed the police station at 12:20 a.m. Detective Stone had a hunch that Mark Hayden was not telling the truth. Furthermore, there was an alarming detail embedded in the testimony. That detail was Robert Wagner. Stone knew that he was already connected to 2 other disappearances. Back in July 1998, the Missing Persons Unit noticed that despite being missing for 9 months and supposedly being in Queensland, Barry Lane was still regularly withdrawing his welfare payments like clockwork from a petrol station ATM in the northern Adelaide suburb of Elizabeth. Police got a warrant to set up a video surveillance camera at the ATM. This was the 90s in Australia, so they didn't have all those inbuilt cameras yet. When they reviewed the footage, they saw the person making the withdrawals was Robert Wagner, not Barry Lane. You f***ed. This is it, dude. This is the beginning of the end. It must be. Wagner was Lane's ex-lover. Moreover, shortly before vanishing, Lane had told his ex-fiancée, Michelle Behay, that he knew about the disappearance of Clinton Tresize. According to Lane, Tresize had been murdered. In August 1998, the Missing Persons Unit had applied for a warrant to put Wagner under surveillance and to tap his phones. The judge rejected this request, citing insufficient probable cause, and whatever Wagner was doing, perhaps welfare fraud, was not a high priority. But now, in November 1998, after adding Elizabeth Hayden to the list, Robert Wagner could be connected to 3 disappearances. Bro, what? Being connected to 2 disappearances is not enough just for a wiretap on a phone? What the f***? That's enough, no? At 1 a.m., Detective Stone dispatched 2 patrol cars to drive up to the residences of Robert Wagner and John Bunting. He didn't give a shit about waking people up when it could make the difference between life and death for a missing person. Yeah, okay, good. I guess in my mind, I'm like, there's no rush because they're all dead, but obviously the police don't know that, so good for them. The patrol officers instructed Wagner and Bunting to call Stone at missing persons. Stone requested that they come by the station for questioning. Wagner arrived just after dawn on the 27th. Bunting said he'd be there by 6 p.m. that evening, but he didn't turn up to the station until November 30th. The statements of the 2 men matched the story given by Mark Hayden. The reason why Bunting was 3 days late for the interrogation was because he was in a blind panic. They needed to move the barrels from Hayden's garage to a new location. The question was where? Surely Bunting at this point must be like, they're watching. They're watching. No? And if they're not watching, why aren't they watching? None of the men could risk having the barrels at their houses, which might be searched any day now, and they couldn't risk dumping the barrels in the countryside or in an abandoned building without taking the risk of someone stumbling across them. Despite them being submerged in acid, the bodies in the barrels had not dissolved and could not just be poured down a drain. And besides, the barrels had long since ceased to be a disposal method for Bunting. They had become trophies. After 2 days of searching for a location, Bunting asked his friend, Dennis Cordwell, to store the barrels at his country cottage, 2 hours north of Adelaide in the township of Hoylton. Cordwell was told that the barrels contained kangaroo carcasses that Hayden had shot with an illegally owned automatic weapon, so they had to keep them hidden from the police. At midnight, on November 29th, Bunting, Wagner, Hayden, and Jamie Vlasakis loaded 4 of the 5 barrels into an unregistered Toyota Land Cruiser and then hooked the vehicle up to a trailer pulled by Robert Wagner's car. They could not fit the 5th barrel into the Toyota, so they put it in Jamie's car. Wagner and Bunting headed up to Hoylton and dropped off their grisly cargo at Cordwell's place. The Land Cruiser, containing the 4 barrels, was left in a thicket not far from the house. Meanwhile, Jamie had moved out of Bunting's house on Burdekin Avenue and into his own place just days earlier, so he transported the 5th barrel to Murray Bridge and stashed it in the trunk of a burned-out old car in his backyard. The next day, with the evidence concealed, Bunting finally turned up for his interrogation. On December the 1st, the police were granted a warrant to search Mark Hayden's residence. Too slow, guys. In order to keep the pressure up on Hayden, they conducted multiple searches over the next month and a half. The first visit revealed that Elizabeth Hayden had apparently run away with another man while neglecting to take her purse and bank card. How have you not got rid of those things, you clown? The second search revealed that she had left behind her diamond engagement ring and gold wedding band and had thrown some soiled clothes into a garbage bag. The third search involved forensics experts who doused the place with luminol and an ultraviolet light indicated a large blood stain on the bathroom wall. Mark Hayden said it was from one of his dogs which had given birth. Nevertheless, the forensic techs swabbed a sample. They're going to be able to tell, right, if that's human blood. This is the late 90s? Late 90s. They got that technology. Throughout December, Dennis Cordwell's wife Anne complained to John Bunting that the barrels stank and had to be moved. Indeed, the hot summer sun of January did nothing to abate the smell. Anne could get no closer than 20 feet from the Land Cruiser before she was overwhelmed by the putrid stench. She told Bunting to just dump the kangaroo carcasses in a nearby creek. People would assume they'd been machine-gunned by farmers, for whom kangaroos are a perpetual pest, and be none the wiser as to exactly who did the killing. But Bunting refused. Obviously, he couldn't tell Anne Caldwell that the people might be slightly more alarmed if he dumped human body parts in the local creek. Anne continued to demand that the barrels be moved, but Bunting said it was too risky, lest they get stopped by police while transporting them. On January the 13th, 1999, police conducted another search of Hayden's home, finding several unregistered firearms and a large supply of ammunition. How did they not find this the first time? How thoroughly are you searching? It's like, I guess we just missed all the guns before Hayden was charged with a firearms offence, which carried a few months in prison and a hefty fine should he be convicted. At any rate, it was a nice thing to hold over his head for leverage. Police also conducted a search of Hayden's garage. They didn't find much, but detectives noted a foul odour lingered in the air. It was an odour they all immediately recognised as being rotting flesh. They also noticed a large number of old maggot casings in one part of the garage. Oh, gross. Like the little things that the maggots shed when they turn into flies. I can't remember why I had it. I wasn't a big fishing person as a kid, but I definitely went fishing a couple of times. And I remember I had the bait box of maggots. Why did I have this? I had this at some point. And then it's I went to go fishing again or whatever. When was I into fishing? I definitely remember this. And I opened it up and some of the maggots had turned into flies. It was gross. Flies had obviously been feasting on something that had to be later moved. Detectives strongly suspected that this had been Elizabeth Hayden's body. Meanwhile, the cops canvassed the neighborhood, and one of Mark Hayden's neighbors, Suzanne Dickinson, gave a statement that on the night of November the 29th, she and her daughter had seen a man loading something into a Toyota Land Cruiser. Police took notes that no such vehicle was on Mark Hayden's property or registered in his name. Meanwhile, in early January, Dennis and Anne Cordwell moved from their place in Hoyleston to a house at 25 Railway Terrace in the sleepy rural community of Snowtown. Much to Anne's chagrin, they took the Land Cruiser with them on the understanding that John Bunting would soon find another place to stash the barrels it contained. Meanwhile, the Toyota sat in the Cordwells' driveway, and when the wind shifted, it blew the stench of rotting flesh right into their house. John Bunting grasped it out to find a place where he could store his reeking murder trophies. Then he noticed an ideal location just down the road from the Cordwells' house in Snowtown, an old derelict bank at 30 Railway Terrace. That's where, several hours ago, we started today's episode. Calm before the shitstorm. The South Australian State Bank in Snowtown had closed its doors in August 1995. 4 months later, in December, the building was sold for approximately $45,000 or $91,000 today to Snowtown residents Andrew and Rosemary Michael. They thought the building's prime location in town would make it an attractive venue to rent out to local business owners as a shop of some description. There was even a kitchen in the old bank, meaning the place could, in theory, be converted into a modest cafe. There was also a house behind the main building, which had for decades been the bank manager's. In 1996, a local woman rented the bank from Andrew and Rosemary and set up a plant shop. The woman moved into the house behind the bank. However, after a year, the shop went bust. The woman continued to rent the house behind the bank, but from that point forward, the bank itself remained empty. Then, in mid-January 1999, Rosemary Michael got a phone call from a man who identified himself as John. He claimed to be looking for a storage facility and wanted to come by and look at the bank. When Rosemary Michael met John outside of 30 Railway Terrace the next day, another man named Mark was with him. Rosemary showed the two blokes the building. The man named John took a particular interest in the bank vault, which lay open and unlocked. John explained that they had some valuable car parts that they wanted to store in the building. Rosemary and the two men settled on a rental price of $60 per week. It's extremely cheap. They paid 2 weeks' rent up front, plus an additional 2 weeks' damage deposit. Despite the fact that John did most of the talking, the lease was put in the name of the monosyllabic man next to him. He signed the contract in childish scrawl as Mark Ray Lawrence. This was Mark's birth name, and they hoped it would throw off the cops while at the same time avoiding the charge of rental fraud by providing a purely false name to a landlord. That night, under the cover of darkness, the 4 barrels inside the Land Cruiser were taken down the road and loaded into the bank vault. Meanwhile, John Bunting and Elizabeth Harvey decided to move from their house on Burdekin Avenue in the town of Murray Bridge back to Adelaide. Bunting, ever the neo-Nazi, oh yeah, I forgot about that, he was a neo-Nazi, wasn't he, cited the arrival of a new large group of Aboriginals in the town as the reason. As usual, Bunting and Harvey rented a subsidised home from the Housing Trust, this time located at 49 Mandera Court in the northern suburb of Craigmore. Moving house was the perfect cover to transport the 5th barrel from the trunk of the burned-out car in Murray Bridge to Snowtown, with the barrel being concealed among a load of other possessions. The transport of the 5th barrel went off without a hitch and the vault door was sealed. There was no key or combination. In order to open it, one had to pick the lock with a bit of wire. Again, brings me back to my comments in the beginning. It's a bank vault. You're just picking that shit open, with a bit of wire? It's not a very good bank. On February the 8th, Rosemary Michael swung by the bank to see that the vault door had been closed, but nothing was stored in the rest of the building. To allay any suspicion, Bunting arranged for Dennis Cordwell to store some old equipment from his electronics business there. Cordwell always noticed the foul odor of rotting meat whenever he loaded more equipment into the lobby. Meanwhile, in the second week of February, the Missing Persons Unit in Adelaide determined there was enough circumstantial evidence to upgrade the disappearance of Elizabeth Hayden to a murder investigation. Good. The State Police Major Crimes Branch was now involved. It soon became a multiple murder investigation since police found just cause to link Bunting, Wagner, and Hayden to the disappearances of Clinton Tracey's, Barry Lane, and most recently, Suzanne Allen, who had disappeared from her home in 1996, leaving behind all her possessions and her pets. Allen's bank account was also briefly registered to John Bunting's address in Murray Bridge. Bunting had claimed, at the time, Suzanne Allen had stayed with them before supposedly leaving the state with a new boyfriend. The fact that the investigation had been elevated to major crimes meant that it was easier to get warrants for various things. Accordingly, on February 25, 1999, detectives received permission to use wiretaps and covert surveillance of the suspects. Finally. However, there was insufficient money and manpower to conduct 24-hour surveillance. As it turned out, police only managed to have eyes on the suspects approximately 2 days per week, so there was plenty of opportunity for Bunting, Wagner, and Hayden to move around unobserved. Also working in the gang's favor was that they rarely paid a visit to the bank in Snowtown. Bunting had given a spare key to the bank's side entrance to Dennis Cordwell, who kept an eye on the place. As such, Adelaide police were entirely unaware of the bank's existence. The wiretaps didn't seem to be yielding much either. Due to legal restrictions, the police couldn't listen to them in real time. To preserve citizens' privacy, specially appointed monitors had to comb through hours and hours of material and only pass on things that were deemed relevant to the case to the police. I mean, yeah, that's a pretty good way of doing things, actually. I didn't realize that was how it was. I thought the police just listened to everything. But it's nice that these seem to be these independent monitors to just pass on the relevant stuff because, yeah, privacy. Woo! That's not the case anymore, right? We just got computers spying on us all the time. We've been listened to right now, no doubt. Hello! No one cares about my boring existence. But, if I was a criminal, I think surely they'd just be able to get that stuff fairly easily. I mean, Siri's probably listening to me right now. And Bunting's gang were generally careful not to discuss their criminal activities in detail over the phone. In the meantime, John Bunting was pissed off at the relatively small amount of money he was getting from the welfare deposits of his victims. All in all, considering the number of murders over the course of 7 years, Bunting's gang hadn't actually stolen that much money. Only about $95,000, or $175,000 in modern Australian currency. It was a good chunk of change to be sure, but 3 years' wages at best, split between Bunting, Wagner, Hayden Vlasakis, and to a lesser extent Elizabeth Harvey. Back in 92, they hadn't thought to try and steal Clinton Tracey's money nor Paul Davies' money in 96. Elizabeth Harvey had managed to scam $17,000 by impersonating Suzanne Allen, but they'd pulled the plug after the cops came sniffing around. They'd stolen some of Michelle Gardner's welfare money for a few weeks, but then Centrelink had stopped the payments because her housemate, Nicole Zaretta, had told the welfare office that Gardner had left without a forwarding address. Thomas Trevelyan's payments were immediately cut off after he was found hanging from a tree, and Elizabeth Hayden's money was sure as hell too dangerous to touch with an active police investigation going on. Given their blasé attitude previously, I'm kind of surprised they're not like, it's fine. Barry Lane's money was still flowing in, but that cash was going to Wagner, not to Bunting. That left the welfare income of Gavin Porter, Fred Brooks, Troy Yude, and Gary O'Dwyer, which Bunting shared with the heroin-happy Jamie Vlasakis. Bunting occasionally posed as Porter to collect his bogus carer's pension. Jamie impersonated the 3 other men at different Centrelink offices and banks. Then, in March 1999, Jamie got arrested for riding an unregistered motorbike and for non-payment of previous traffic fines. He was bailed, but had to lay off the welfare fraud for the time being. Bunting needed another victim to make up the shortfall, but he didn't dare attempt anything with the police breathing down his neck. Additionally, Bunting's sadism had gone unsatisfied since November. By April 1999, Bunting's craving to kill had become overwhelming, so he took a gamble and went with Robert Wagner to the local cop shop in the suburb of Elizabeth to claim about police harassment. Detective Superintendent Barry England and Detective Greg Stone listened very unsympathetically. Once Bunting had finished ranting, Barry England brusquely invited Bunting to lodge a formal complaint with the Adelaide Police Headquarters. Bunting got up in a huff and left, with Wagner following closely on his heels. They never did submit a formal complaint. Nevertheless, Bunting got the impression that it accomplished something, because for the rest of April and early May, the police stopped coming round. Bunting interpreted this as the cops being afraid of a lawsuit and not finding enough evidence to bust him. Oh, no. They're taking advantage of you thinking that you've done something, so you're going to become more sloppy while they are still watching. In reality, yes, the cops were just giving Bunting enough rope to hang himself with. Very good plan. The idea was to make Bunting think that they'd backed off so that it'd be sloppy and reveal something about the murders or where he had gotten rid of the bodies. Yes, it was a clever strategy, or at least it would have been, if it didn't wind up getting another person killed. Oh no! This is exactly, if I was a cop and we were talking about what to do, I'd be like, this is a great plan. But somehow someone dies. Dad, I'm going to Perth. Jamie Vlasakis' stepbrother, David Johnson, was born in Adelaide in 1975 to parents Marcus and Carleen Johnson. In 1980, they divorced, and Carleen won sole custody of David, his twin brother Michael, and his older brother Nigel. In 1989, Carleen moved the boys to Hamilton, Victoria. The following year, when David was 15, he announced to his mother that he wanted to move back to Adelaide to live with his father. She consented and took David there herself. Marcus Johnson was surprised at the news and told Carleen that he needed to ask permission from his new partner, Elizabeth Harvey, whose 4 boys were already living with them. Elizabeth said yes on the condition that Carleen pay them money to buy them some furniture. Later, Elizabeth claimed more welfare money from the government because David was now living there, but she spent the money on herself. David Johnson did not get on well with his step-siblings Troy, Jamie, Adrian, and Christopher, and generally kept to himself. 2 years later, in 1992, Marcus and Elizabeth broke up. David and his father moved out again and got a flat of their own, but Marcus stayed in Elizabeth's orbit and would frequently pay her visits. In 1994, Elizabeth Harvey shacked up with John Bunting. David Johnson was afraid of Bunting, who seemed erratic, volatile, and was always threatening to beat David up for no reason. For Bunting's part, he disliked how David took pride in his appearance, being well-groomed, and despite growing up in the slums of Salisbury North, chose to wear good quality clothes. Bunting called David a yuppie and a faggot. The latter of these insults was somewhat inaccurate, since David Johnson was something of a lady killer, the type of bloke the girls were always chasing. And David himself had something of a roving eye, often cheating on the women he was dating. I believe the kids today call that a boy. I think you're right, David. In order to get away from the rather toxic environment where his father still carried a torch for the frankly horrible Elizabeth, whose new boyfriend was a psychopath, David Johnson spent a few months in 1994 living with his mother back in Hamilton. But in 1995, now aged 20, David returned to Adelaide and was living with his father and Bunting's ex-wife Veronica in 203 Waterloo Corner Road, where Paul Davies and Suzanne Allen would soon be buried. In the summer of 1996, David and Marcus moved out to a flat of their own. David's stepbrothers, Troy Yude and Jamie Vlasakis, frequently visited their apartment, sometimes staying for days at a time. David didn't like either of them. He thought Troy was a temperamental asshole and Jamie was a useless junkie addicted to heroin. Well, he's right. At one point, a skagged-out Jamie blabbed to David that John Bunting had, quote, murdered someone about 10 years ago and gotten away with it. David did not know whether to take Jamie seriously. Then Troy Yude disappeared in September 1998, and David had a strong suspicion that John Bunting had something to do with it. When visiting his mother in Hamilton that Christmas, David and Carleen discussed the possibility that Troy had been murdered. Carleen encouraged her son to go to the police. David said he had no evidence and the police wouldn't listen to him. 2 months later, on February the 28th, 1999, Carleen traveled to Adelaide to convince David to come back and live with her. She told David she feared for his safety and suspected Bunting was up to no good. Bang on. David replied that he made sure to never be around Bunting unless it was in a public place, and that he was saving up money to move in with his girlfriend Linda in Adelaide. Carleen departed 2 days later, never to see her son again. On May the 7th, 1999, Jamie Vlasakis visited the flat David Johnson shared with his father. Jamie told David about a computer his mate was selling for $200. The catch was they'd have to drive into the country, somewhere north of Gawler, to get it. David was thrilled about the price, but, as he said to his girlfriend Linda that night, knowing Jamie, it's probably a 2-hour drive north of Gawler. Meanwhile, the wiretaps recorded a phone conversation where Bunting asked Vlasakis whether he had managed to convince Johnson to go to Snowtown yet. Jamie replied, no, he's spending the night over at this Sheila's place, but I'll go get him if you like. Bunting replied not to bother. It was getting late. 2 days later, on May the 9th, at 6:40 p.m., a wiretap on Jamie's phone picked up another conversation. Robert Wagner asked Jamie whether he was on his way to Snowtown. Jamie replied in the affirmative. Wagner asked, quote, so, you've got Pusshead with you? Again, Jamie said yes. At 6:56 p.m., the wiretap picked up another call. Jamie picked up and said, hello. Bunting said, quote, this is the voice of happiness speaking. Jamie gave a rather fake-sounding laugh and told Bunting they were on their way. Because David Johnson was in the car at this point, Jamie kept up the subterfuge by saying, so, are we still alright for $200? The machine is all set up, is it? Bunting ignored this and instructed Jamie to walk into the side door of the bank where he and Wagner would be waiting. Police surveillance teams did not have eye on the gang that evening, and they did not hear the phone recordings until weeks later, when it was far too late to realize the significance of David Johnson's trip to Snowtown. Even if they had heard the recordings 24 hours after the calls were made, which was the earliest the independent phone monitors could have delivered them to the police, they still would have been too late to save David Johnson's life. At approximately 3:30 p.m., Jamie Vlasakis and David Johnson arrived at the bank in Snowtown. David accidentally kicked the steel gates that opened from the street leading to the side entrance. The woman who lived in the house above the bank looked out of her window to see the source of the noise. Jamie gave her a friendly wave. She nodded in acknowledgement and pulled the curtains. As they entered the bank, David thanked Jamie for scoring him such a good deal on the computer. They entered the bank, walked through the old staff kitchen, and into the bank manager's office, where David Johnson laid eyes on John Bunting. Behind them was a computer. Turned on, David was surprised to learn that Bunting was the mate that Jamie had been talking about, and no doubt wondered why they'd come all the way up to Snowtown to see the computer when they all lived in Adelaide. Suddenly, Robert Wagner came up behind David Johnson and grabbed him by the throat. Bunting quickly cuffed David's arms behind his back. Then he was forced to sit down on an old TV that Dennis Caldwell was storing in the bank manager's office, and David asked, "What the hell's going on?" Bunting replied, "You'll be going home in half an hour, if you cooperate." David looked at Jamie and asked, "You promise?" Jamie replied, "Yes, I promise," knowing full well is a f***ing lie. David Johnson was ordered to hand over his wallet and divulge his PIN number. Then Johnson was moved in front of a microphone hooked up to the computer. Instead of using a tape recorder, this time Bunting had decided to use a 1990s soundboard to reproduce the voices of his victims. That way, at least in theory, Bunting wouldn't have to rely on just a few set phrases, but could cobble together new ones as needed. Of course, nowadays we know that individual words cobbled together on an old soundboard does not produce a natural-sounding sentence, but Bunting was enamored with the tech and wanted to give it a go. David spent the next 90 minutes recording his voice into the computer. He was made to say every number from 1 to 100, and then was forced to say the names of 70 people he knew, then a couple of hundred individual words like yes, no, maybe, computer, pub, f***ing shithead. Then to hedge his bets, Bunting got Johnson to record dozens of full phrases like, "Never phone me again," "If I never see you again, it'll be too soon," "You're not my brother, you're a piece of shit," "Your mother is a whore," "Tony, you're a liar," "Tell Amanda to eat and die," and "Dad, I'm going to Perth." Doubtless, during this protracted recording session, it must have dawned on David Johnson that Bunting was going to use the recordings to mislead people when he disappeared. Given what David knew about Troy's disappearance, he must have realized that Bunting, Wagner, and Vlasakis were going to kill him. After the recordings were finally done, David Johnson's clothing was cut off him with a Stanley knife. He was forced to lie down on a black plastic sheet that had been laid out on the floor. They beat him. Bunting shoved one of David's own socks into the victim's mouth and secured it with a layer of duct tape. Then there's some details. Well, it's not too bad. They beat him very severely. I mean, it's bad, but it's not torture yet. Bunting orders Jamie to also beat him, and he complies. The assault ceased just before the next round of torture was to begin. However, at that point, Bunting ordered Vlasakis and Wagner to go and find an ATM to make sure that the PIN number Johnson had given them was correct. Wagner and Vlasakis piled into Wagner's car, and they drove away at high speed, 50 kilometers south to the town of Port Wakefield, with Wagner swerving all over the road. Meanwhile, Bunting held off from torturing Johnson. Wagner will be irritated if he missed out on any of the sadism. Wagner and Vlasakis arrived at a petrol station in Port Wakefield and tested David's bank card in the ATM. They tried to withdraw $5. The machine rejected it. Jamie called Bunting on his mobile and reported, "It says not authorized. Cancelled." Bunting replied, "Oh." In other words, he's broke. There's no money. Get back here. It was then that David Johnson, realizing that when Wagner and Vlasakis returned he would be killed, seized his opportunity to escape. Johnson sat up on the plastic sheet, curled into a ball, and slid his cuffed hands from behind his back under his legs. He then tackled Bunting and threw him to the ground. David Johnson started viciously kicking his would-be murderer, breaking several of Bunting's ribs. Then David grabbed the Stanley knife off the floor and brandished it at Bunting, who got up and retreated back a few steps. For a moment, it looked like David Johnson might be able to escape onto the street, but then Bunting called out for Wagner to help, knowing full well that Wagner and Vlasakis hadn't returned from Port Wakefield yet. David Johnson momentarily turned his head toward the side door of the bank, and Bunting tackled him to the ground, sending the Stanley knife skittering across the floor. Then Bunting grabbed David Johnson's belt, which lay next to them, and wrapped it around Johnson's neck, looping the belt through the buckle, and he pulled it tight with all its strength. David Johnson slid his thumb underneath the belt to try and relieve the pressure, but such was the force with which Bunting strangled him that the belt merely fractured Johnson's thumb. After a few minutes, it was all over. David Johnson lay face down on the floor, dead. Robert Wagner and Jamie Vlasakis returned to the bank to see John Bunting trying to pick the lock on the bank vault with a length of wire. Wagner peered into the manager's office, saw Johnson's corpse, and flew into a rage. He yelled, "I'm the one who's supposed to f***ing kill them." Bunting, holding his sides in what was likely considerable pain, explained that David Johnson had attacked him. After a while, Robert Papa Smurf Wagner managed to calm down. Then the three men donned plastic overalls and prepared to dismember the victim's body and seal it in the 6th barrel of their collection. But first, Bunting and Wagner decided to unseal the other barrels and admire their past handiwork. Then, Jamie helped Wagner put Johnson's body headfirst into the 6th barrel. Jamie observed that Johnson's body was small enough to fit in one piece, but Wagner said, "This one's going to be a slice and dice," and he began hacking with a knife at Johnson's legs anyway. Meanwhile, at approximately 11:30 p.m., Robert Wagner's mobile phone rang. Because Wagner was up to his elbows in blood and guts, John Bunting answered. It was Dennis Caldwell, who had arrived back home to see a note from Wagner on his door asking him to call. Bunting told Caldwell that they were at the bank in Snowtown and asked if they could come over to his house for a bit. Caldwell got curious about what they could be doing in the bank and headed down the street to find out. Oh, Caldwell, you're going to get in trouble. Bunting met Caldwell at the side entrance, took him into the manager's office, and showed him the programs he'd downloaded on his new computer, including the soundboard. After several minutes, Jamie Vlasakis came out of the vault wearing plastic overalls spattered with blood and stinking of rotting meat. Jamie held out his arms and said to Caldwell, "Give me a hug." Caldwell told him to piss off. Jamie started laughing. Robert Wagner walked out of the vault, also in plastic overalls splattered with blood and stinking to high heaven. Dennis Caldwell recalled, quote, "He had a very strange look on his face. He was staring at me intensely. Thinking back, I think he may have thought that I'd seen something that I shouldn't have." Caldwell made a little more small talk and then made his way to the side door. Robert strode forward and repeated Jamie's joke, saying, "Give me a hug." Again, Caldwell replied, "Piss off." Wagner chuckled. After Caldwell left, Wagner went back to the vault and retrieved a piece of David Johnson's flesh, sliced from one of his legs, which he had wrapped in a plastic glove. They sealed the vault, left the bank, and walked down the street to Dennis Caldwell's place. Jamie immediately used Caldwell's shower. When he emerged from the bathroom, he found Robert Wagner frying Johnson's flesh on the stove. Wagner sliced off a bit, stabbed it with a fork, and waved it in front of Jamie's face. "Try a bit." Jamie immediately began dry heaving and ran out of the house. Once he had collected himself, he hopped in the car and departed for Adelaide. This is f***ed up. Meanwhile, back inside the house, Dennis Caldwell watched in blissful ignorance as John Bunting and Robert Wagner cannibalized part of David Johnson's corpse. What the f*** is this? This is like, what the fuck? Why? Full circle. On May the 11th, 1999, 2 days after the murder, Bunting sent Jamie Vlasakis to the flat David Johnson had shared with his father Marcus. Jamie told Marcus a lie that the 24-year-old David Johnson had illegally gotten a 13-year-old girl pregnant, and to top it all off had crashed his car into a building and was hiding from the police. Jamie said that he'd come by to pick up some clothes for David, along with some paperwork that would allow the quote-unquote David to claim unemployment benefits. On May the 13th, Jamie returned to the flat with Robert Wagner to collect some of David's furniture. While they were there, David's girlfriend Linda arrived. She hadn't heard from him in 4 days and was getting worried. Jamie pretended that he didn't know that Linda was David's girlfriend, and when she asked why, Jamie claimed that David told him that he had dumped Linda 3 or 4 years ago. Then Jamie added that his stepbrother had been seeing a girl named Amanda, which was true, David Johnson had been cheating on Linda, and that he had accidentally gotten yet another girl who was 13 pregnant. That was a lie. Linda didn't know what to make of all of this, but suspected that it was bullshit and told Jamie that if she didn't hear from David, she would call the cops and report him missing. Ooh, you're walking on dangerous territory here. Meanwhile, John Bunting rang Tony. The characters, there's like 100, 200 people in this episode. I'm like, I have to say, several of them are like, I don't know where this dude came from or what he's up to. I know they're all like vaguely friends and related somehow, but it's a spider web of people. Meanwhile, John Bunting rang Tony, a friend of David Johnson's other girlfriend, Amanda. Tony picked up. Immediately, she heard a recording of Johnson who said, "Tony, you're a f***ing liar. Is Amanda there?" Tony said no. The line went dead. Tony rang Amanda to ask what was going on. She had no idea. When Tony finished speaking to her, the phone rang, and another recording of David played, this time saying, "Tell Amanda to eat and die." Then Bunting turned his attention to composing a soundboard message for Linda. He played it over the phone for Jamie Vlasakis, which was captured by police wiretaps. The message said, "Fuck off. Hey, this is David. Linda, how fucking hard is it? I'm not interested. Fuck off." Jamie criticized it, saying the message sounded distant and hollow like a robot's. It also is a bit weird to start off a phone conversation saying "fuck off" before saying who was calling. Suffice to say, the soundboard experiment hadn't been a staggering success, so John Bunting phoned Linda and gave her a mobile phone number on which Bunting said that she could contact David. It was a prepaid burner Bunting had bought. When Linda rang, Bunting got Jodie Elliott to answer the phone, pretending to be David's side piece in the hopes that this would enrage Linda to the point that she stopped calling, to the point that she stopped looking for him. At least, temporarily. Linda didn't report David Johnson missing and didn't call him the mobile number again for a week. Jodie Elliott had no idea she was helping to cover up a murder. Yeah, why would she? They've pulled the wool over her eyes, and it wasn't that hard. On May the 16th, 1999, police surveillance spotted Wagner and Bunting traveling separately in 2 cars, heading in the direction of Snowtown. The police had no idea what the significance of Snowtown was. But Bunting and Wagner had obviously gone there for a reason, so Adelaide detectives Craig Patterson and Brian Swan decided it was worth it to pull into the town of 400 people and talk to a local constable, Ian Young. During the course of the conversation, Patterson mentioned that they were looking for a Toyota Land Cruiser that may have been used to transport the body of murder victims. Ian Young got out his notebook, where he had scrupulously logged the arrival of an unregistered Land Cruiser into town in late January. Constable Young said that it was parked in the driveway of 25th Railway Terrace, which had recently been rented out by Dennis and Anne Caldwell. Detective Patterson and Swan made note of this, but decided they shouldn't search the Land Cruiser themselves, but leave it until some forensics techs could get up to Snowtown to look at the vehicle. This didn't happen until 4 days later on May the 20th. Detective Steve McCoy and Greg Stone, along with forensics officers Bronwyn Marsh and Gordon Drake, were dispatched to Snowtown at 11:30 a.m. to chase up the lead and determine whether this Land Cruiser was the one they were looking for. They drove to 25 Railway Terrace. Detective McCoy pounded on the door, and Dennis Caldwell answered. McCoy told him that they suspected the Toyota Land Cruiser in Caldwell's driveway was involved in the disappearance of Elizabeth Hayden. Caldwell, who knew nothing about the murders, told McCoy the full story about how John Bunting and Robert Wagner had brought the Land Cruiser, full of stinking barrels supposedly containing kangaroo carcasses, to their place in Hoyleton back in November 1998. Then in January, when Dennis and Anne Caldwell moved to Snowtown, Bunting and Hayden rented the old bank down the street to store the barrels. Upon hearing this, McCoy's eyebrows must have risen so fast that it's a miracle they didn't rip off his face and fly into the stratosphere. He immediately stopped the interview with Caldwell right there and then. The cops regrouped at the local police station to devise a plan of action. McCoy opened the meeting by saying, "I think we found the bodies." And that is the line that I believe we started today's episode with many hours ago. Flawed justice. McCoy, Stone, Drake, Marsh, and the regional detective Rick Day proceeded to the bank, where they were let in by Dennis Caldwell. It was there they found 6 barrels containing the remains of 8 people. They called for backup. 20 more police officers and forensics techs raced up to Snowtown and worked all night cataloguing evidence. The barrels were moved back to Adelaide for closer examination. The cops still didn't know for certain who was in the barrels or exactly how they had been killed. At 5 a.m. on the 21st of May 1999, Detective Chief Superintendent Paul Schramm, head of major crimes, assembled 50 officers at police headquarters in Adelaide. Many of them had been woken up in the middle of the night. Some of them even had their vacations cancelled and were ordered to come in. They were all briefed and shown video footage of the bank vault and the insides of the barrels. The assembled officers were then given their marching orders. It was time to take the bastards down. The police surrounded the houses of John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and Mark Hayden for a simultaneous arrest at 8 a.m. At Bundeera Court, John Bunting went quietly, whispering to Jamie Vlasakis, who was back living with him, to get rid of any possessions they'd kept from the victims. Vlasakis realized the game was up and didn't bother. Mark Hayden was arrested at Blackham Crescent and did not utter a single word, refusing to even verbally acknowledge that he had been read and understood his rights. At Moughlin Road, Robert Wagner also went relatively quiet, but his fiancée Vicky Mills was shocked at what was going on and flew into hysterics. She had no idea the man in her life was a sadistic murderer. Once in custody, Bunting, Wagner, and Hayden refused to talk and simply asked to call legal aid in order to obtain lawyers. Hair and blood samples were taken from them. Bunting's girlfriend, Elizabeth Harvey, was also taken down to the station but not placed under arrest. For 2 hours, she was questioned about her involvement in the disappearances of Elizabeth Hayden and Suzanne Allen. Harvey denied impersonating Allen in order to collect her social security benefits. She continued to deny this, even after police found a letter that Centrelink had addressed to Suzanne Allen 3 years ago still in Harvey's purse. When was the last time you emptied out your purse? When she asked about her own son, Troy Yude, who had been missing for 9 months, Harvey did not seem to think it was conceivable that Bunting had murdered him. Harvey was charged with welfare fraud, made bail, and returned home. By mid-afternoon, on the 21st of May, Bunting, Wagner, and Hayden were in the dock at the Adelaide Magistrates' Court, where they were each charged with a single count of murder of a person unknown. This was enough to hold the 3 men, while police figured out how many in total the men had killed and who in 7 household the victims were. By this point, the story had broken across Australia and was already being heralded as the worst serial killer case in the country's history. Journalists flooded into Snowtown, increasing the population by a literal third. Locals spotted them trying to peek under the side door to the bank as if that would accomplish anything. More bizarrely, locals spotted a couple of journalists trying to sniff under the door on the off chance that they could report to their audiences that they'd smelt the lingering stench of dead bodies. It was a circus. Jamie Vlasakis, who had not been arrested or brought in for questioning, was in a blind panic. He telephoned a friend named Wally Fitzgerald and started to unload on him all the details of the murders and Bunting's arrest. Fitzgerald thought Jamie was stoned and talking nonsense. He hung up on him. An hour later, Vlasakis arrived at Fitzgerald's house and tried again to unload the full story, including how 2 additional bodies were buried under 203 Waterloo Corner Road. Fitzgerald pretended to listen sympathetically, and the next day, May 22nd, he called Crime Stoppers and reported everything that Vlasakis had said. Jamie was arrested on May 26th. He got his lawyer to cut a deal where Jamie would tell police everything he knew in exchange for an immunity from all prosecution. Whoa. That's a hell of a deal your lawyer scored, Jamie. But then Jamie started spilling his guts before any sort of deal had been finalized. What are you doing? His confessions took 19 days and filled 2,000 pages of notes. It'd be 10 months before police informed Jamie there was no deal. Nevertheless, Jamie still chose to cooperate, either out of remorse or because he hoped this would lead to a lighter sentence. And in fairness to Jamie Vlasakis, it was most likely both. He was charged with 5 counts of murder at the beginning of April 2000 and locked up in Yatala prison under heavy protection. His testimony would be crucial to the trials of Bunting, Wagner, and Hayden. However, it appeared that the biggest danger to Jamie Vlasakis was Jamie Vlasakis himself. He attempted to end his own life twice while in custody and was transferred to a psychiatric hospital. Yeah. So this is why we have all the details. Like, we went through today's episode and it's like, well, someone on the inside. I thought it might be the mysterious third man at points who's spilling all the details. But now we know it was the 2,000 pages of notes from Vlasakis. On June the 23rd, 1999, the police arrived at 203 Waterloo Corner Road to excavate the tunnel in which the bodies of Ray Davies and Suzanne Allen were concealed. It took authorities 5 hours digging to a depth of 3 meters, just shy of 10 feet, before they found what they were looking for: the skeleton of Davies and 11 trash bags containing the dismembered remains of Allen. Several months later, the Housing Trust demolished 203 Waterloo to avoid it becoming a grisly tourist attraction and a shrine for a panoply of weirdos. Meanwhile, using information provided by Jamie Vlasakis, the body found in 1994 in a farmer's field in Lower Light was re-examined by forensics experts and identified as the remains of Clinton Tresize, who'd gone missing in 1992. On December the 11th, 2000, a committal hearing was held in which John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and Mark Hayden were charged with 10 counts of murder, with more charges forthcoming. The committal hearing lasted a whopping 9 months before anything moved to trial. The court heard from 68 witnesses who took the stand, and 1,458 additional written witness reports were submitted. Jamie Vlasakis was charged with 5 counts of murder: Gavin Porter, Troy Yode, Fred Brooks, Gary O'Dwyer, and David Johnson. The 20-year-old pled guilty to 4 of the charges, denying having been involved in the murder of Gavin Porter and only being shown his body afterward. Then Jamie made a statement, quote, "I personally don't trust the police, and I thought that if I tell them that John would be arrested, given bail, and then he'd get me, or we'd both be arrested and put together in the same cell. I just had to make a decision. It was the wrong one, but I believe that the more John was convinced that I was part of the plan, the safer I was. I know the damage I've done to people's lives. I wonder what went wrong, and why I cannot change the terrible things I have done." Well, the reason you can't change the terrible things you've done is because time moves in one direction, doesn't it, genius? Bunting, Wagner, and Hayden shouted abuse at Vlasakis during the hearing because he'd ratted on them. From that point forward, it was decided that Vlasakis would appear in separate sessions from them. Jamie ultimately received 4 consecutive life sentences. The 5th murder charge was dropped. In exchange for his testimony and the trials of Bunting, Wagner, and Hayden, Vlasakis was given the possibility of parole after 26 years, starting from the date that he was taken into custody on May the 26th, 1999. That means that Jamie Vlasakis, now in his mid-40s, could be released from prison in May 2025. Only if there's a possibility. It doesn't mean he's going to get parole. Jamie's mother, Elizabeth Harvey, could have been charged with murder or for being an accessory to murder. Not only had she impersonated Suzanne Allen to get welfare money, but she'd also been aware of some of the murders and actively participated in the murder of Ray Davies, even to the point of stabbing him and helping Robert Wagner strangle him. However, back in November 1998, Harvey had been told by a doctor that the supposedly benign tumour she'd found in one of her breasts in 1993 had turned cancerous. She got a mastectomy, but it had already spread to the rest of her body. In late 2000, she was too sick to stand trial. She died February the 5th, 2001. On the 13th of August, 2001, at the start of the lengthy committal hearing, Bunting, Wagner, and Hayden officially pled not guilty to 10 counts of murder. Another hearing subsequently was called in February 2002, where Bunting and Hayden were charged with the murder of Clinton Tresize in 1992, and Wagner was charged as an accessory. All 3 men were charged with the murder of Thomas Trevelyan in 1997, staging it to look like he'd hanged himself. Again, the men pled not guilty. So massive was the case that the pre-trial did not begin until March 2002. It soon became clear that the prosecution would have a difficult time convicting Mark Hayden of 12 murders, as there was limited evidence that he was present at many of them. Judge Brian Martin dismissed 9 of Hayden's murder charges, leaving only the ones for Clinton Tracey's, Troy Ude, and his own wife, Elizabeth Hayden. The defense also won a motion to have Hayden tried separately from Bunting and Wagner on the grounds that Hayden was, quote, a peripheral figure and not a ringleader. Thus, the defense argued the jury should not be prejudiced against Hayden for being tried alongside Bunting and Wagner. A few days later, the murder charge for Tracey's was also dropped. The charge for Elizabeth Hayden was also flimsy, since it was pretty clear that Mark Hayden had taken Jodi Elliott out of town to produce an alibi at the time of Elizabeth's murder. The prosecution wanted to go ahead with it anyway, since there was some ambiguity about when she was killed. The charge for Troy Ude was on further grounds, since Troy used the title Chief Inspector on the recording, and Vlasakis testified to Hayden being there. However, both the trials resulted in a hung jury, and Mark Hayden received no prison time for murder. The prosecution slapped Hayden with 6 charges of being an accessory on account of his helping to cover up some of the killings, of which he was convicted of 5 and admitted to 2. He received a 25-year sentence with the possibility of parole after 18 years, which he has not received. Because his sentence started with the date of his arrest in 1999, Hayden is due for release in May 2024. He will be 66 years old. On September the 27th, 2002, while the pre-trial arguments were still ongoing, Wagner decided to plead guilty to the murders of Barry Lane, Fred Brooks, and David Johnson in a bid to beat the other murder raps, get 3 consecutive life sentences, and maybe land the possibility of parole after a quarter century. Being only 27 at the time of his arrest, if the gambit paid off, Wagner would be a free man sometime in his mid-50s. Meanwhile, going for broke, Bunting claimed innocence on all 12 counts of murder. These guys have to go away forever, right? This is like whole life shit. No parole. The other guys got like 25 years for being periphery. And these guys are the core monsters of today's episode. The trial itself finally started on October the 16th, 2002. Bunting and Wagner were tried together. 15 people were selected for jury duty instead of 12, with the court anticipating that an unusual number of jurors would drop out due to the sickening and gruesome nature of the case. The prosecution not only had the testimony of Jamie Vlasakis, but the tape recordings made of the 5 murders in which Bunting and Wagner can be heard. There's also the DNA evidence of the killers on the overalls and disposable plastic gloves found in the bank, the possessions of the victims being found in Bunting and Wagner's houses, bank records, and video footage of the murderers withdrawing money from the victims' accounts, and a mountain of other forensic and circumstantial evidence. There was also a poem that Wagner, like an idiot, wrote about the murders while in prison on August the 28th, 2000. You're breaking the first rule, mate. He even calls himself a serial killer in the poem. The prosecution called 220 witnesses, whose testimony lasted 140 days. The testimony of Jamie Vlasakis alone lasted 32. Once the prosecution rested, the defense took less than 2 hours to present their case against the charges. Bunting's lawyer called 3 witnesses. Wagner's called only 1. On September the 8th, 2003, over 4 years since the barrels had been discovered, the jury reached a verdict. Firstly, Robert Wagner was found not guilty of being an accessory to the murder of Clinton Tracey due to a lack of evidence. Secondly, the jury was hung on the murder charge for Suzanne Allen. Bunting and Wagner claimed that Suzanne Allen had died of natural causes and had simply dismembered her body and concealed her remains in order to scam her welfare money. Forensic examination of the 11 garbage bags of her dismembered remains had not yielded a clear cause of death. The murder charge for Suzanne Allen was ultimately dropped altogether in May 2007. As for the rest, Bunting was convicted of 11 counts of murder, Wagner was convicted of 10. Bunting and Wagner were given consecutive sentences for each conviction and denied the possibility of parole. They will both die in prison. Excellent, that's what I like to see. Bunting stayed seated and read a book while the sentence was handed down. Afterward, Robert Wagner read a prepared statement, quote, "Pedophiles do terrible things to children, and innocent children have been damaged for life. The authorities do nothing about it. I don't know why. I was certainly angry. Somebody had to do something about it. I decided to take action, and I took action. Thank you. No, you liked murdering people, you piece of shit. And you murdered plenty of innocent people, didn't you?" Dismembered appendices. Number 1. Due to his status as a rat, Jamie Vlasakis remains a target not only for Bunting and his associates, but for prison inmates in general, due to the unwritten rule among convicts about snitches. As such, when Vlasakis began his prison sentence, he was given a fake name, and court order prevents anyone from divulging the specific prison at which he is incarcerated. If Vlasakis is paroled in 2025 or later, it is highly unlikely there will be a public announcement in the media, and it's probable that Vlasakis won't be found unless he wants to be found. Number 2. The events of the murders were depicted in the 2011 Australian film Snowtown, which presents Jamie Blasakis as a fairly sympathetic character who stumbles into John Bunting's violent world. Bunting is depicted as an evil genius who is soft-spoken and self-possessed until he explodes with murderous rage, which is definitely not the man in real life. He was a perpetually ranting, angry lunatic who was extremely lacking in intelligence. The movie has some moments that are either heightened or confected for dramatic purposes. Despite being slow-moving, typical of such art house films, not much is shared about the histories of the various perpetrators and victims. In terms of movies based on true crime, it's not offensively lurid or gruesome. The film was a critical darling, but a box office bomb. Number 3. In contrast to the movie's devilish, calculating version of John Bunting, if you watch the 2005 Snowtown episode of Crime Scene Investigations, you will see an Australian actor who is a dead ringer for Jack Black playing John Bunting. Discount Australian Jack Black chews the scenery with his over-the-top acting and behaves like an utter maniac. Well, yes, it's amusing to watch. It is also much closer to how Bunting generally behaved in real life, and you can find it on YouTube. Number 4. Unlike many notorious sites associated with serial killers, the bank in Snowtown remains standing to this day. Locals often see tourists pulling up to the old bank, getting out, looking around, taking some photos, and then driving out of town. Because there are 2 banks in Snowtown, with one of them still active, tourists often stop and take photos in front of the wrong bank. Locals don't try to correct them. 30 Railway Terrace has been sold 4 times since 1999, most recently in September 2012 for $187,000. The old bank is owned by a married couple who live in the house behind it. They have rather unsuccessfully tried to rent out the bank as a commercial property. Yeah, sometimes with these things, like the other things, you just got to demolish them and start again because there's just too much baggage. Number 5. Despite the fact that Snowtown was chosen almost at random to store the barrels and that the killers came from elsewhere, since 1999 the town has endured an indelible stain of notoriety. The murders are known internationally as the Snowtown murders. If I called this episode anything else, people wouldn't recognize it, which is a shame because Snowtown is actually quite a nice little place. Locals are frankly sick and tired of the murder tourism and only being associated with these horrific events. It's the number 1 reason outsiders ever visit Snowtown. Imagine constantly having to discuss the murders with tourists for a quarter century. Yeah, it's just grim. It's just not the best. Therefore, to end on a cheerful note, and out of respect to Snowtown's 400 beleaguered residents, I will point out that Snowtown has a number of exciting attractions sure to delight and amaze. Come to see Snowtown's Big Blade, a stupendous 116-foot-long monument from a wind turbine, then look in awe at the beautiful murals painted on Snowtown's water tower. Number 7. This is one of the longest casual criminalist scripts I've ever written, just shy of Dharma by 500 words. I'll surely agree there have been a lot of layers and a lot of players. Many players involved in the case, but I wanted to produce the definitive detailed account of the Snowtown murders on YouTube. Most accounts of this case are little more than summaries, amounting to crazy people you barely know killed a bunch of victims whose stories will go unmentioned in a race to get to the bank part. If you like my detailed research and eloquent writing, thank you, David. You're right. Please don't forget to pick up one of my books, The Shortest History of Sex or The Shortest History of the Universe, which Simon probably plugged about 18 hours ago at the start of the video. I don't even remember if I did. But yeah, pick up one of David's books. They're excellent. Thanks for being here. That's where we end today's episode. It was a long one, wasn't it? And that's the end of today's video. Just a quick reminder at the end here to check out Conflict of Nations, the free online PvP strategy game happening in modern global warfare. Grab your exclusive gift of 13,000 gold and a month premium subscription for free. Offer available only for 30 days. Click that link below and I'll catch you on the battlefield.